Good morning, it is 3 minutes after 10 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Allegations, accusations surrounding, or directed at Russell Brand continue to surface and dominate much of our news coverage. Obviously, we have to be very careful not so much what we can and can't say on air, but what you can and can't say on air. And if you come on the show and commit a libel, it isn't you that gets sued, it's me, or indeed LBC. So it's tempting, though that probably is from your side of the microphone. It's definitely not tempting from mine. I am drawn to the conversation that, while recognising the seriousness of the accusations and the vulnerability of the women coming forward, the nature of the defence or the nature of the response and the repeated denials speaks of an almost an alternate universe, which one writer in the Times today describes as a haven for the credulous. I haven't really been following where Russell Brand has gone in the last few years, but my goodness me, I've had a crash course in it this morning, and we may explore that side of the story a little later in the programme, but frankly, you have to persuade me that I can trust you to remain on the right side of both libel laws and other considerations. It is obviously the morning upon which we sit here and slap ourselves around the face with a wet kipper. In fact, we should probably form a circle and take it in turns. I'll go first. I'll slap myself around the face with a wet kipper, and I'll hand it to you. Because as I glance to my right, appropriately enough, actually also to my left, so it doesn't quite work as a metaphor. As I glance to my far right, there is a woman standing behind a lectern who automatically, when you see that image, brings two thoughts to mind. The first is, that is a disgrace, in reference to the fact that Britain imports quite a lot of cheese from cheese-producing countries. And what was the second thing she said behind a lectern? It wasn't me. Oh, no, that was Shaggy. Funny, really, that Nick closed the show with news that Rishi Sunak can rap the opening bars of Ice Ice Baby by Vanilla Ice, when, in fact, his predecessor in Downing Street is probably the most famous Shaggy tribute act in the country. It Wasn't Me being Shaggy's, of course, most famous hit. And what Liz Truss is doing today, well, there's so much to talk about here, but I haven't quite got the question finessed yet. I know you're used to that by now and probably bored of me pretending that it's all a deliberate ruse to create more organic radio than the traditional format allows. But what is astonishing, there is so much that is extraordinary about this. I just want you to pause just for a minute, all right, and see if you can remember the figure that most experts put upon Liz Truss's premiership, the cost of Liz Truss's premiership. I think £35 billion is a cautious estimate. We may not know for sure until economic cycles are complete. Pork markets, thank you, Ryrie, that was indeed the other thing. So you've got cheese. Importing cheese is a disgrace, and pork markets are going to save us from the economic impacts of Brexit. I told you there was a lot to get through. Focus, James, focus. So I think 35 billion quid is a cautious estimate on what she cost the country. And the brevity of her premiership was historical. I think there was there was a chancellor who died in office and therefore spared Kwasi Kwarteng from being the shortest serving chancellor of all time. I think you should actually get a free pass if you perished. I don't think you should be counted in the annals of shortest serving chancellors or shortest serving prime ministers if you died on the job, because that means that the cessation of your period in office was not caused by your own competence or incompetence. It was caused by your death. But I think, was Liz Truss the shortest ever? Has anyone been in the job shorter than Liz Truss? Until she came along, Ian Duncan Smith, I think, was the only Conservative leader never to lead the party into a general election. So some wonderful, wonderful company there. And in many ways, Ian Duncan Smith is emblematic of the broader problem, because treating blithering idiots as if they are valid contributors to public discourse is a large part or a large contributor to the creation of the problems we've got now. And as if to prove it, who has turned up at Liz Truss's speech this morning? Who do you think's turned up early? Here is a list courtesy of LBC's highly respected reporter, Henry Riley. It's not just me that says that, by the way. It's Surrey Heath Council as well. Nigel Farage is there. Lord Frost is there. Patrick Minford is there. Julian Jessup is there, a, quote, fellow, end quotes, of the, quote, Institute of Economic Affairs, end quotes. Sir Rocco Forte is there. He is a hotelier and staunch Brexiter, as they like to call themselves, who revealed earlier this year that he was thinking of moving to Italy because it's easier to do business there. In fact, I think the direct quote was, it will be easier to expand in Italy than it would be in the Brexit Britain that he both sought and voted for. Matthew Elliott is there, the founder of the, quote, Taxpayers Alliance, end quote, and indeed the former chief executive, I think, of, quotes, Vote Leave, end. No, that doesn't need quotes. It was just called Vote Leave. There's no irony in that particular title. It did do exactly what it said on the tin. And then there's quite an odd bloke who sells smoked salmon and ended up as a sort of bag carrier stroke butler for Nigel Farage called Lance Foreman, but you don't really need to worry about him. Out of those names I've just noticed, Nigel Farage, Lord Frost, Patrick Minford, Julian Jessup, Sir Rocco Forte and Matthew Elliott, how many of them do you think merit a whole chapter in my new book, How They Broke Britain, which is a fairly comprehensive account of precisely how we ended up with someone like Liz Truss in Downing Street, spaffing something like £35 billion up the wall as a consequence of epic incompetence, unbelievable entitlement and bogus ideology. Which of those six? They're all in it. They all get quite good mentions to varying degrees. Farage, Frost, Minford, Jessup, Forte, Elliott. Have a guess at which two get their own chapters, all right? You can text it to 84850. It's not, I haven't got enough books yet, hasn't it, to give a free copy to whoever gets it right. It might be really obvious, actually, looking at it, but maybe not. Anyway, that's the country we live in now. You can be proven not just spectacularly, but historically wrong about everything. In fact, Farage, Frost, Minford, Jessup, Forte, Elliott would fit fairly neatly into that category. But because you are sponsored by the most powerful engines in society, whether it's the Conservative Party or the conservative media or the very, very wealthy plutocrats who fund the secret think tanks that Matthew Elliott is such a wonderful example of, as long as you've got them on side, you can continue to argue that black is white, that up is down, and that the unicorns are going to be here by tea time. High on lettuce, perhaps. And that is extraordinary, truly extraordinary. Liz Truss is giving a speech to the Institute of Government in which she seeks to absolve herself of almost all blame for what she did. She seeks to blame everybody from the Office of Budgetary Responsibility to the BBC for her epic incompetence and gross unsuitability for office. And she seeks to... or she deigns, really, to tell Rishi Sunak what he should be doing with regard to economic policy. Just pause right there. Just pause right there. Everyone's getting it wrong. Perhaps I should give a free book. I mean, it's not out for a while, but I'll give a book to the first person who gets it right. You're all getting it wrong. I can see why. Oh, Truss is in the book as well. So Farage, Frost, Minford, Jessup, Forte, Elliott. Which three... leave Truss out. I've already told you she gets a chapter. 11 minutes after 10 is the time. Liz Truss is today giving a speech in a fairly august environment. The Institute for Government is not a secretly funded right-wing think tank doing the bidding of its anonymous donors while pretending to be contributing honestly to public discourse. The Institute for Government is a solid affair. And she's telling Rishi Sunak what he should be doing economically or in terms of tax cuts. There's another bit as well, which is frankly astonishing. You know, we talk a lot on this programme about class. There are two things about middle-class people deigning to comment on what, quotes, working class, end quotes, people think that really boil my brains. The first is the imputation that everyone's racist. The red wall is racist. Everybody's racist. Working class values involve racism. That is absolute Horlicks. The biggest racists I know are writing for The Spectator and The Daily Telegraph. Or rather, the biggest racist I come into regular contact with via media. It's not as if I'm going to knock about with these people. It's absolute Horlicks to do that. There was a successful attempt to blame the consequences of austerity on immigration. That's largely what got Brexit over the line because, well, chiefly because David Cameron and George Osborne, while campaigning for Remain, could hardly turn around and say, no, look, the reason why your life is rubbish is because of the policies we introduced 6 years ago. So when Farage and, let's do the whole list, Frost and Minford and Jessup and Forte and Elliott popped up to say the reasons why your life is rubbish is because of all those French people and Polish builders, the government of the time, which was ostensibly supporting Remain, couldn't turn around and say, no, actually, it's all on us. It was our policies that robbed your communities of infrastructure. It was our policies that saw businesses fail on the ground. It was your policies that took away your library. It was our policies that took away your Sure Start. Nothing to do with EU membership, but there we go. And now she's standing up at the Institute for Government giving a speech on what she got right and why everyone else is wrong and why the BBC is to blame. And then we get to the working class point, which the second thing about the middle class people commenting on working class people that really boils my brains is this sort of idea that they know what the values are. So on the one hand, you have racism, and on the other hand, you have this. Well, here you go. So in this new book by the political editor of The Telegraph, she is quoted as saying, who's paying their effing wages? It's plumbers in Dartford that are paying their wages. You know, the ceramics workers in Stoke-on-Trent. I mean, that was certainly a valid point in the 19th century, maybe for much of the 20th. But the ceramics workers in Stoke-on-Trent as representatives of the great British working class, it gets better. The bridge builders. The bridge builders. These are the people paying their wages. The IMF, Labour, the Treasury officials, the BBC, have they ever seen a tax rise they don't like? And ironically, I think it was one of the weird new TV channels, possibly GBB's, when Liz Truss was asked to comment on something pretty egregious that they'd done. She said, I don't think politicians should ever criticise journalists. That's because she's a fraudulent liar. She's quite happy to criticise the BBC, as am I, but I would never sit here and say to you, I don't think we should ever, I don't think politicians should ever I don't think radio presenters should ever criticise other journalists. That's quite a charge. And then turn around and criticise other journalists. 10:15 is the time. We still haven't got a question. No one's got it right. That's really, really surprising. It's not Minford and Frost. It's not Farage and Frost. It's quite incredible. I'm slightly worried now that I might have encouraged you to turn me off and put Liz Truss on just to have it, but you'd probably get more laughs, wouldn't you, in the course of the... So we'll pick over the bones of the speech. Henry Riley's there, bless him. What I want to do is a step back question today. Get out of the weeds, get out of the detail, focus upon this central point. The most catastrophic Prime Minister in the history of these islands is, about a year after running out of Downing Street with her pants on fire and having set fire, indeed, to the British economy, is standing up in public, speaking as if she is more sinned against than sinning, attended upon by various half-wits and sociopaths, and expressing a truly held belief that she was right and everybody who pointed out how stupid she was wrong. And it is being reported, it is being broadcast live on news channels, it is being talked about on the biggest show in town. This one, yeah. And I want you to pause for a moment and just tell me why. How? There's two elements to this. There's the systemic answer. How have we ended up living in a system where someone who set fire to the economy can, within a year, turn up expecting respect and expecting reverence to tell everybody why the evidence of their own eyes and ears should be completely ignored and you should just listen to her because she'll tell you the truth. So the systemic answer to the question of how has this happened? How have we ended up in a place where you can still... I don't know, merit respect, if you like, or still merit an audience despite having been so catastrophically awful? And the second question is possibly more interesting, but also more nebulous. What's going on in her head? 0345 6060 973. If you had done what Truss has done, I don't think you would ever show your face in public again. I truly don't. It is as if you'd spent your whole life dreaming of being a football player and you got a run out in the last 10 minutes of the FA Cup final and it was 0-0 with moments to go and the ball, the goalkeeper fell over his own shoelaces. You somehow ended up with the ball 5 inches from the goal line. all you had to do was stroke it over the line, but you contrived somehow to trip over it and break your nose. And you would want to hide for the rest of your life, right? I don't know what you do for a living. Imagine messing up on a scale so egregiously awful that you would not want anybody ever to remember your name or indeed remember your face. That, I think, is a normal reaction to failure on that scale, that unprecedented, historic scale, an unbelievable level of incompetence and catastrophe. And Liz Truss today is exonerating herself, blaming everything from the moonlight to the sunshine, never mind the boogie, and deigning, this is the bit I find astonishing, deigning to pronounce on what the current and future prime ministers should be doing. So the systemic answer to the question is perhaps the more substantive one. How have we ended up in this place? But the more interesting question perhaps, how or what is going on in Liz Truss's head today? 0345 6060 973. Off the top of my head, it's like Brian Clough giving a speech on how brilliant things went at Leeds United. That might be a tiny bit niche. It's like Gerald Ratner giving a speech on how he is a superb business leader that got everything right during his time at the helm of the family firm. It's like, I can't do any of those because they're a little bit ripe, but you're just someone who is a byword for failure, trying to sort of recast themselves as a motivational speaker. What, and this is the question I want you to answer first, what is going on in Liz Truss's head? 0345 6060 973. Hit the numbers now. You will get through. It is 22 minutes after 10, and it is, I suppose, one of those mornings where I want you to explain it either to somebody from outer space or someone who's been in a coma for 10 years. How can a Prime Minister who presided over the single most catastrophic premiership in British history stand up within a year in a respected, august forum and cast herself as a misunderstood victim of circumstances rather than the most blithering of blithering idiots? And it's all about Britain, it's about our society, and it's, for me at least, something about her that I can't quite pin down. And there are no prizes this morning for texting me in response to the answer of what's going on in Liz Truss's head. You do not win a prize for saying nothing, James. Or even, in the words of Paul Daniels, James, not a lot. Because something clearly is. And I want to know what you think it is. Phil's in Finchley. Phil, what would you like to say?
Yeah, James, I've listened to you many times, and not being personal, you spend, hear me out, you spend a lot of time personalising it, whether it's Jacob Rees-Mogg, whether it's Liz Truss, whether it's anybody.
Yes, when I'm talking about persons.
Yeah, no.
Yes.
I'm talking about that you can go on all day. You are not going to get a decent standard of politician today.
Why
we
not?
are a country because they're not attracting the right people. We are a country of 68 odd million, but we have a small landmass. The best thing is you don't need 650 odd MPs, one a mile down the road. You need quality, not quantity, maybe 250, 300 MPs. And they're working.
I think, listen, mate, when I have that phone in, I promise I'll take your call. But on the question of what has...
I'm going on to that.
Well I think I'm with the bloke who just tooted you. Hurry up a bit, will you?
Right. Liz Truss is only there for her own importance. She is bigoted. She is there for the power. The money helps. So it doesn't matter what the subject is. It doesn't matter.
Well, no, it has to. It has
She's
to.
It's totally egotistical.
Well, have a look at the people who are in the room. So what you're missing, with respect, is not the paucity of the pool from which politicians are picked. It's the machinery that propels people like Truss to prominence. So the list of people that are there right now, Farage obviously just provides sort of xenophobic chatter from the background, which persuades voters that they need to vote against their own interest because foreigners are causing all their problems. Matthew Elliott is the sort of patron saint of secretly funded think tanks that masquerade, if you like, as contributors to public discourse from an objective perspective, but are actually simply doing the bidding of whoever it is that funds them. You've got Minford, who was the only economist in the world who argued that Brexit would be a good idea. It is a little bit more complicated on this occasion, Phil, even if your central points were to be true. On this occasion, the case of Truss and the unbelievable arrogance is a slightly more complicated case than you allow.
Well, it's the arrogance of the people who are going to hear.
It's more than arrogance. It's more than arrogance. I don't want to answer the questions that I've asked, but you're pushing me into an uncomfortable position. The reason why Truss is allowed this platform, is allowed this forum, is because this is what these people want to hear, even within a year of it being so catastrophically dismantled.
You and I wouldn't go along. We wouldn't want to hear it.
No. I would want to hear it in order to come to a better understanding of how we've ended up where we are.
Because of what I first said,
it's not that, though. It's not that, though. It's not that, though.
I think it is. Have a good day.
Well, you have a good day. It's the people who have flourished in this ecosystem were already there. Patrick, you can grab Phil's phone line if you're quick. 0345 606 0973. It's a more nuanced question than we sometimes ask on the programme, but it's a really, really important one. Liz Truss lives in a country where you can be the worst Prime Minister in history and within a year expect a fair hearing for your self-exculpation and your blaming everybody else for your own disaster. And perhaps crucially, she believes she's qualified to offer advice to the current Prime Minister. 10:26 is the time. Patrick is in Lambeth. Patrick, what would you like to say?
Hello, James.
Hello,
Hi,
Patrick.
how are you?
Very well.
That's good. My take on Liz Truss is this, and it goes back really to even before she was Prime Minister. I think she lacks self-awareness. I think she probably is an extreme narcissist, and I think she probably shares those traits in common with her predecessor, Boris Johnson. And I think what that means is you're just not able to understand or recognise that actually things really went wrong and why that was and what that means in terms of how you look at that yourself.
But then how and I suppose the fact that she was never elected by the country and it needed only to persuade the Conservative membership to give her a run out is part of the answer to the question I'm about to ask you. But not unlike Phil before you, if the analysis is correct and she is so obviously awful, how does she end up in Downing Street?
Well, I think there was definitely a campaign among people that were supporting Boris Johnson to stop Sunak from getting into number 10. What I think was very interesting about the campaign that took place in summer 2022 was how there seemed to be a concerted effort to ensure that Truss was the second candidate that came through the MP part of the process. And then the membership, the MP part of the process, and not Penny Mordaunt.
She was a long way, but she was in quite a distant third until the Daily Mail got behind her. I worry, Patrick, that almost everything I say of interest on the programme at the moment is going to be suffixed with the phrases, it's all in my new book, but it is all in my new book. And it was Dacre, presumably because he thought Truss was the best chance of him clinging on to the knighthood or the peerage that Boris Johnson had promised him. It was the Daily Mail that pushed Truss back into the forefront of the contest. You're right, it would have been between Mordaunt and Sunak otherwise.
I think so, and I think Penny Mordaunt, Sunak seems to be putting Penny Mordaunt very much in her place. Everyone's quite frightened of Penny Mordaunt just because she's so popular with the membership.
She seems quite human, although Kemi Badenoch is currently playing the role of Liz Truss when it comes to wooing the membership, despite not displaying much by way of objective talent.
Can I say?
Yes, you can.
Can I say why I think that maybe Truss is getting more traction at the moment, and maybe why she feels more confident about speaking out when the etiquette for former prime ministers is to stay quiet, and there's lots of precedents we can point to.
Stay quiet for a while and then come forward.
Indeed, but even Theresa May, who's finally spoken up, has spoken up in, I think, quite a moderate way without trashing people right and left, even though she probably has every right to do so, I suspect. But parking that, I think it's because the hard medicine that's been meted out by Hunt and Sunak, and by the way, some of that was part of the reversal of the mini-budget that was done when Hunt was Truss's Chancellor, but we'll park that. That tough medicine is not really delivering growth. It's not delivering anything other than a sense of malaise and, dare I say it, a feeling of stagflation.
Yes.
I spoke to my friend who's a successful fund manager a few days ago, and he describes the UK as like a third world country, banana republic.
Yes.
Too much debt, too little growth.
How does this play? So she's still. So you're saying there's almost some logic to her thinking that she's still got a point. I'm just a bit late for the news. That's what I mean.
Well, the question is simply this:
Go on.
Where does the growth come from?
Yes.
And nobody seems to have an answer to that in terms of the economic growth. All we have at the moment is the orthodoxy that you need to get inflation down, have a recession if need be, and then we start again and look for growth. And I think there's a gap there, and I believe that gap exists within the Tory party.
And anything will. So it's a vacuum. It's a vacuum rather than a gap, and therefore anything can move into it. As I suppose her disastrous tenure as Prime Minister would demonstrate. Patrick, thank you. 10:31 is the time. The question is. Right, it's a simple question, but the answers will be anything but. How on a national level, a systemic level, how mad is it that we're sitting here today watching Liz Truss deliver a speech in which she sort of casts herself as a stateswoman, more sinned against than sinning? 0345 6060 973. But crucially, how did we end up with such a wombat in Downing Street and this sort of retrospective rearguard defence kicking off across much of the right-wing media? And then perhaps the question that intrigues me the most, talk to me about what you think is going on in Liz Truss's head. Like when she resigned as Prime Minister, you could be forgiven for thinking that you would never hear from her again. And yet here she is saying it wasn't me. It was all their fault and I was right all along. It's a mark of a slightly mad country, I think. 10:32 is the time. Thomas Watts has your headlines. It's 25 minutes to 11. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. And in many ways, this is a more serious subject than perhaps I've allowed in the first half an hour. The fact that we are a country in which Mark Carney, former governor of the Bank of England, one of the most widely respected central bankers in the world, gave a speech this weekend in which he laid bare many of the reasons that lie behind our current malaise. And, of course, he was demonised and vilified by much of the right-wing media. Liz Truss, who was championed and cheered all the way to Downing Street by them, where she soiled herself on an epic scale, economically and politically speaking. There's a sort of rehabilitation underway, and it involves, in many ways, her trying to absolve herself of all blame for everything she did. And that is, I mean, I know I've written a whole book about it, but I am more interested today in what you think the answer to the question of how this could happen to our country. And it's not a left-right issue. This is the country of John Major, okay? It's the country of Tony Blair, obviously, but it's the country of John Smith. It's the country of Margaret Thatcher. It is a country in which this could not have happened previously. You couldn't have failed. I don't think you could have got to Downing Street with such a poor skill set. I don't think you could. And I certainly don't think you could have messed up so spectacularly when you got there without doing a sort of profumo and spending the rest of your life working with the dispossessed in order to try and claw back some sort of credibility. In his case, of course, moral credibility. In her case, political. So we are a country where being absolutely awful doesn't seem to matter. And Liz Truss gets defended, most obviously in the pages of The Telegraph and even The Spectator. Even the Daily Mail seems to have given its head a wobble. But I just want to pin down the process that we've gone through as a country that can leave us treating her as if she has any right whatsoever to contribute to public discourse. And in many ways, the people that are in the room with her today, you could ask the same question about almost all of them. How have we ended up in a place where people think Nigel Farage or the secretly funded think tanks represented by Matthew Elliott or a hotelier who makes donations to Tory parties? These people somehow get to drive political discourse. And I think you probably wouldn't have one, i.e. Liz Truss, without the other, i.e. this bizarre and incestuous network. 10:38 is the time. The number you need is 0345 6060 973. And if you prefer a simpler question to answer, what is going on in Liz Truss's head this morning as she continues to give advice to Rishi Sunak, blame everybody but herself for her own disastrous premiership, and seek to exonerate herself, seek to exculpate herself as somehow a victim of circumstances rather than her own daft conduct? Nick's in Lambeth. Nick, what would you like to say?
Well, I'm very relieved, James, that you reverted to the first question, what's going on in Liz Truss's head?
Yes.
Because I'm really not equipped to answer the one about what's happening to this country,
no,
the big one.
Yes.
But basically, I think it's about the next Tory leadership. I mean, there's a battle, a murderous battle for the soul of the Conservative Party going on.
Yes.
People know they're going to go down very badly at the next general election, and then the knives will be out for Rishi Sunak, who, with large swathes of the Tory party, he's not popular. It never was popular, and for some reason, some fairly unpleasant reasons, and some fairly reasonable reasons.
Sure.
And so basically, she's staking her pitch, and all the people around, I was going to say ghouls, but the people around her who almost religiously adhere to this idea that you've got to have a small state, you've got to have low regulation, you've got to have low taxes. They're saying, look, we need to reassert our ideology in the public space and reassert it.
And we have
strongly.
to do it. We have to do it quickly, because otherwise the disaster of its implementation will. I don't know what's happening to your phone, Nick. It's very clicky. I don't know if you're banging it on a wall in frustration, but if you could. If you could refrain from doing that,
I will try.
Thank you. They can't sit back for an electoral cycle, because then they could be squeezed out of the conversation altogether. It went so badly that they almost have. It's a bit like Brexit, I suppose. They just have to pretend that it didn't and crack on as if everything is normal and this is perfectly reasonable. Just to help me a little bit with the because I don't know if you saw, one of the things that was rejected was a flat rate of 20% tax for everybody. So they'd abolish not just the 45% tax rate, but the 40% tax rate as well. These are policies designed to make rich people richer and to penalise poor people more. And the claim is that would somehow stimulate economic growth that would benefit everybody. Therefore, the people who've been penalised, the poorer people who've been penalised by these tax policies, would actually be better off because they'd somehow earn more. That is the ideology you're describing, I think. I've never quite understood the second part of that process.
Why the poorer people were better off?
Yes.
I think there's a much more. I don't agree with it. I completely disagree with it. But there's a much more coherent version of low state, low tax than Kwarteng and Truss implemented. They had their ideology and they just implemented it very badly, very badly. And their advisors, whoever they were, sacking the head of the Treasury, ignoring the OBR, office budget responsibility, and so on. It was so clumsy and so ham-fisted.
And here she is.
I think it is a policy which has coherence.
Do you?
I personally, I think it's coherent, but I personally massively disagree. I want
there is a coherent approach to small state, low taxes. It just goes to a different school, Nick. Or you could. I suppose we could bring Hayek. We could bring Hayek into the conversation at this point, and the drift from that sort of post-Keynesian or anti-Keynesian economic analysis that's been undertaken in recent years possibly does deserve a little bit more attention. But I don't buy it personally. I don't see how the redistribution of wealth from those with the most to those with the least can ever be the less attractive option than treating everybody the same in the tax. I just don't. Because some people can't afford to feed their kids. Other people have got 10 houses. In fact, prime ministers. I just don't. I could be wrong, but that's why I mentioned it to you, because I can't find the more, if you like, rational imposition of that idea either. But I have read Hayek. I do understand it. I just don't think it works. Richard's in Kilburn. Richard, what would you like to say? Thank you, Nick.
Hello, James.
Hello, Richard.
I would say that until last week, Liz Truss was consigned to the dustbin of history.
Yes. And
by rehabilitating her, given that she's a product of Tufton Street, right, starting with her career in the fossil fuel industry, she's completely a mouthpiece for Tufton Street. And I believe that the reason, no matter what she says, the debate is still alive. But
it has to be. I mean, if you look at the money and the organisations, the institutions and the individuals that we could file under what you describe as Tufton Street, which is obviously not confined to the organisations that are located there, but it is a description of people who subscribe to this sort of vampiric idea of what government would be. She is absolutely their creature, and so the scale of her failure, the greater the scale of her failure, the more urgent the need to get back out there and start denying that she had any responsibility for it at all.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And as it was until today, or till the weekend. She had become a joke. She was the leftist.
Well, she still is a joke, Richard, I think.
Well, she still is a joke.
Can't we?
But simply by putting her up there, giving what are supposed to be reasoned arguments, it keeps the conversation alive rather than just...
I think we're getting there. I feel.
And that was the zenith of everything that they were going for. Brexit was...
Yes.
The Europe thing was actually just a cover.
That's the warm-up act. The warm-up act. For deregulation, low taxation, hardly any government at all. If you haven't got them, if you can't afford to pay for your own healthcare, your children's education, you can't afford your transport, then sack it. It's your fault. You deserve to wither on the vine. Why on earth should anybody else be supporting you? That's why I use the word vampiric. This was their, what's the word I'm looking for? This was their... it was their Camelot, wasn't it? It was their moment, and it went so appallingly badly wrong that either they disappear forever or they push back from a position of no, it didn't, and if it did, it wasn't our fault, and if it was our fault, it was actually your fault. You made me do it.
Yes, but their attitude towards the poor, or whatever you like to call them, I think David Cameron summed it up, probably almost like a slip of the tongue, by constantly talking about working class people who want to get on in life and better themselves, which implies that unless you better yourself, you have only yourself to blame and you are undeserving.
Yes, working class people who want to give all I get what I deserve and give all I can. There's no room. There's no room for them. We just want to live the best life I can. I mean, working class, middle class, upper class. I don't want to be driven by an overweening need for more. I want to be content with what I have. You're right, Richard, actually. 10:45 is the time, I think, and I'll play you the clip shortly. I think she's just blamed it all on the left, which is astonishing given that out of every household name politician in the country at the moment, I think Liz Truss has spent more time in the Conservative cabinets of the last 13 years than any other. Off the top of your head, can you think of anyone else? And she went in as Environment Secretary under Cameron after Owen Paterson, and I think she was a junior minister before that. So 13 years of Tory government. Liz Truss probably part of more of those various administrations than any other politician in the country. But the responsibility for the failure of her policies and or the general malaise in the country, that's all because of the left or because of a consensus. As if somehow before she became Prime Minister she didn't exist. She appeared fully formed and complete shortly before walking into Downing Street and bears no responsibility whatsoever for the various governments, the governments of Cameron, May. She was in May's government, she was in Johnson's government, but had nothing to do with the consequences of any of them. It is actually surreal the more you think about it. It's 10:46. 10:50 is the time. Good morning, James. Right, it's Mandy. What is occurring with Truss isn't that different from Johnson. They are beyond embarrassment and have so many sycophants around them boosting their ego that they start believing all their own hype, which is so transparent that cellophane has more opaque properties. Very poetically put, Mandy. I disagree with you a bit. I think Johnson's a unique creature. Unique in his appetites, unique in his moral depravity, unique in his absence of conscience. Truss is, in her own mind at least, a genuine ideologue. Johnson doesn't really believe in anything. Truss, I don't know why. Did you know she lived in Kidderminster for a while? Did you know that? Her dad taught at King Charles, a high school, briefly, and she lived in Kidderminster. So I don't know where you take the wrong turn on the journey from Kidderminster to Downing Street and end up actually believing that giving the rich absolutely everything they want is the best way to secure economic growth. There it is. That is why talk of small state, low tax, low regulation, giving wealth or capital everything it wants is really the ideology of Tufton Street, Liz Truss, and... well, there you go. Lord Frost, Patrick Minford, Julian Jessop, Rocco Forte and Matthew Elliott, who are all in attendance. Poor old Nigel is there as well, pretending that he understands the economics or the politics of it and just itching just to scream out, down with foreigners! And then realising he's not in the right room for once in which to engage in that sort of behaviour. But that's it. Give the rich everything they want and everyone else will benefit, which somehow, somewhere, someone might be able to explain to me as plausible and workable. But until they can, it just looks disgusting. It's how you end up blaming the state of the British economy on cheese imports, or indeed on people who haven't been in power for 13 years.
My view is that after the successful monetary policy and supply-side reforms of the 1980s and the winning of the Cold War by the West, we were all optimistic and upbeat about our future, and we took our eye off the ball. Free market economists went off to lucrative jobs in the city, allowing academic institutions and think tanks to be captured by the left. Demand management crept back in, alongside neo-Keynesian-dominated monetary policy. And we Conservatives allowed the debate to be framed and led by the left. Whether it was the anti-capitalist arguments of the Occupy movement, whether it was the diversity, wokery policies, or whether it was the statist environmental solutions, we've all got to admit that it's the left that made the running. And we've seen that regardless of which government has been in power. From the energy price cap to the 2050 climate change target to the ESG agenda in companies, there's been a cultural shift across both business and the public sector towards more left-wing policies. And despite the long record of failure of industrial policy, it's back in vogue again. People are talking about it. And at the heart of this was the basic belief by politicians that the good times would go on forever.
I mean, where do you even start? The energy price cap was about the only thing she got right, wasn't it? And now she's decrying it. That was her own policy, the energy price cap. The think tanks have been overtaken by the left. Right. Which think tanks would those be, off the top of your head? Go on. Anyone? Anyone? Bueller? No. I've got nothing. Oh, in the media, of course. Crikey. The Daily Mail, the Daily Telegraph, the Times, the Spectator, the Sunday Times, the Sun, the Mail on Sunday, the Express, the Sunday Express. I mean, God, the bloody lefties are everywhere, aren't they? You can't swing a cat in the British media without knocking a lefty out anymore. They're all out there. You can name them all now, can't you? Go on. Anyone? Well, that's very kind, but present company accepted. Anyone? Anyone? Bueller? And then this idea that I'm going to have to play it again. Anthony in Bletchley Park, be patient. I will get to you before the news at 11. But if you want, I mean, this is both the answer and the question, he says, sounding a little bit like Confucius. I might just put my fingertips together and hold them under my chin. This is the answer and the question. Because it is because she spouts this bilge that Liz Truss gets promoted by the people who would benefit from a country in which government was geared solely to the desires and the whims of the rich. And it is because that the people who sponsor such bilge are so powerful, i.e. the media and the think tanks, so to speak, and the rest of it, and the Tory party being completely enthralled to them, dedicated solely to the promotion of wealth. Wealth puts her there, and they put her there because she says stuff like this.
My view is that after the successful monetary policy and supply-side reforms of the 1980s and the winning of the Cold War by the West, we were all optimistic and upbeat about our future, and we took our eye off the ball. Free market economists went off to lucrative jobs in the city, allowing academic institutions and think tanks to be captured by the left.
There's a reason why she doesn't name any.
Demand management crept back in, alongside neo-Keynesian-dominated monetary policy.
She doesn't know what that means.
And we Conservatives allowed the debate to be framed and led by the left.
Never mentioned this before.
Whether it was the anti-capitalist arguments
literally never
of
mentioned
the Occupy movement,
Environment Secretary, Foreign Secretary, International Trade Secretary, Foreign Secretary, never mentioned it. Wokery. Wokery is to blame.
The statist environmental solutions.
Down with environmental
We've all
solutions
got to admit
former Environment
that
Secretary.
it's the left that made the running.
The left. 13 years of Tory rule.
And we've seen that regardless of which government has been in power.
Go on. Go in for
From
the
the
kill.
energy price cap to the 2050 climate change target to the ESG agenda in companies, there's been a cultural shift across both business and the public sector towards more left-wing policies. And despite the long record of failure of industrial policy, it's back in vogue again. People are talking about it. And at the heart of this was the basic belief by politicians that the good times would go on forever.
ESG is environmental, social and corporate governance. So it is essentially a school of thought that suggests companies should have a responsibility to behave in an environmental, socially and morally correct way, and that if they don't, you should perhaps not grace them with your custom. It's the idea that they should police their own environmental, social and corporate governments a little bit more robustly. So what she's opposing when she talks about ESG is what you could loosely describe as common decency on a corporate scale. So when I say to you, they just want capital to be free to do whatever capital wants to do, I'm not exaggerating, because they then say it out loud themselves. Although, to be fair to Liz Truss, she didn't sound like she believed it herself there, did she? I think that whoever is yanking her strings is working overtime this morning. Anthony's in Bletchley Park with the last word on this. Anthony, what's going on?
Yeah, morning. Well, she might want to dwell on what Confucius say, which is to be wealthy in an unjust society is a disgrace.
I like that. Well played.
Port markets, really.
Yes, that is a disgrace.
At the micro level, I think that Truss is a symptom of the deep toxic political malaise that we've got in the UK at the moment, in the body politic.
Yes.
And I think the cause, which goes to the core of your question, the one I can remember there is anyway.
Yeah, sorry.
What's going on in her head is the belief that she can do or say whatever she likes and damn the consequences. And in so doing, she damns thousands, if not millions of us, into the bargain, into economic and social pain.
Yeah.
And on a macro level, I see her being the embodiment, as said to your producer, of the dangerous lack of accountability, consequences and impunity. People can say what they want and what they do with no comeback at all in the government.
Yes.
Look at Johnson. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's fine.
He makes millions on the political pundit circuit, and Sunak quietly writing off billions in losses on PEPE. I mean, the government owns stats. Between 20 and 21, there were losses of between 33.2 and 58 billion in fraud and error, and that's unrelated to the pandemic. And there's no clawback.
He's elected not to try to claw back. I'm always slightly wary. It's probably because of what I do for a living. I'm always slightly wary of every issue is evidence of a broader malaise, because that means every phone-in sounds the same. There is something peculiar to Liz Truss, I think, something deeply peculiar. And Stafford Baker has touched upon it. Jean has touched on it in this tweet, where she says she sounds as if she doesn't actually understand the script that she's reading. And I think that's true.
Yes, it is. That comes to one of my other points, is that her talking points come from the client media as much as anything else, because we've become a country where an octogenarian Australian drives national policy.
Yes,
and
it was him who introduced the Institute of Economic Affairs to the body politic in Britain. Not a lot of people know that.
And a man who loves the UK so much is a non-dom, and they infect people's brains.
Did you see the story about the Sunak resignation at the weekend?
Yes, I did. Yeah, and I thought...
Sums it up, really. Sunak was planning to resign, and the Rupert Murdoch executives talked him out of it. It is. Yeah. You've taken me up to the news, Anthony. I'm sorry. I know you have more to say, and no doubt you will say it at a later date. It has just gone 11 o'clock. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I may play you some more of the greatest hits of the Liz Truss comeback tour, but then again, I may not. It depends how naughty you are, to be honest. It's 4 minutes after 11 and you're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Hi, James, says David in Chesham. I'm just listening to your brilliant show. Was Richard from Kilburn at 10:43am the actor Richard Gibson who played Herr Flick in Hello, Hello? I'm certain I recognise the voice. I love that. There's a little Easter egg for you there. I don't know, to be honest with you, but I mean, sometimes you have astonishing powers of vocal recognition, but... other times, I guess people just coincidentally sound similar. Same Christian name, Richard in Kilburn. If you are Richard Gibson, who played Herr Flick in Hello, Hello, please make yourself known to us. It is 4 minutes after 11. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. What are we going to do next? I know what story we're going to do next. We're going to talk about the Labour Party's decision to give votes to 16-year-olds. And make about 1.5 million people under the age of 18, although, of course, they'd have to get their ID, which has also proved to be about as successful as most other Tory policies of the last 13 years. The reason that this story gives me pause... Come here a minute. It's important. The reason this story gives me pause is because if you tell me what your politics are, I can tell you what you think about this proposal. Now, that's true on quite a lot of the conversations that we have together. Tell me what you think about foreigners, and I'll tell you how you voted in the Brexit referendum, right? Tell me how you feel about people you think were born better than you, and I'll tell you who you voted for in every general election that's ever gone, really, except the 2019 one. So, tell me what you think about refugees. I'll tell you what you think about Black Lives Matter. Tell me what you think about high taxes. Well, taxes is a tricky one, actually, because like Brexit, it's a wonderful example of people being persuaded to routinely and regularly vote against their own interests. So you tell me whether you are right-wing or not, and I'll tell you whether you're in favour of votes for 16-year-olds and 17-year-olds. And I'd like to conduct this conversation in a slightly less binary way if we can. The stupidest people I have ever encountered in mainstream political discourse are grown-ups, are adults who voted for Brexit. I'm not saying everyone who voted for Brexit was stupid, but my God, some stupid people voted for Brexit. And some of them, of course, on this programme, people who thought that there was a campaign underway to abolish 3-pin plugs in the United Kingdom, therefore they voted for Brexit. A lovely lady who thought that the leaving the European Union would mean that she could have her fish and chips wrapped in old newspapers again without any other wrappings interfering with her delicious enjoyment of manky old sweaty newsprint. We took calls from people. Well, there's the obvious call from the bloke who thought there'd be fewer brown faces on the tills in his local Tesco. I mean, levels of ignorance and stupidity that were, I think, historic. They were epochal levels of stupidity. And none of those people were 16 or 17. The woman on Question Time who said that she was about to vote Remain, but then she saw a straight banana in the supermarket and realised that the EU had gone too far, so she voted for Brexit. And it's not just voters, Nadine Dorries didn't know what the customs union was, or indeed how Channel 4 was funded, and she ended up as Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport. Jacob Rees-Mogg struggles to tie his own shoelaces without Nanny's help, and he ended up as Business Secretary for 10 minutes when Liz Truss was Prime Minister. Oh, Liz Truss was Prime Minister. The evidence of stupid people flourishing in our political ecosystem has since 2015, 2016 been a veritable avalanche of evidence. So the idea that 16 and 17-year-olds are not mature enough to vote, or not informed enough to vote, or not educated enough to vote is obviously and objectively stupid. It is obviously and objectively wrong. And if you can find me one 16-year-old who's not really ready to cast a vote in a general election, here's someone who voted for Brexit. They cancel each other out. I would have thought more or less entirely. 8 minutes after 11 is the time. But I don't want to close the conversation down. It's probably too late, isn't it? What I want you to do is come to me with valid, thoughtful reasons why 16 and 17-year-olds who are already able to vote in local and national elections in Wales and Scotland, that's crucial, I think, because they are obviously part of the United Kingdom. Is there any objection to 16 and 17-year-olds voting other than your fear of how they are likely to vote? And they are likely to vote in support of more equality, probably, a fairer distribution of wealth, better recognition of the threat posed to the planet by pollution and man-made climate change. They are simply more likely to vote intelligently than older people educated during a different era. Hit the numbers now, you will get through, okay? 0345 6060 973. But, there may be more powerful arguments against it than I have yet encountered. What I've encountered so far is people who have gammon for brains shouting about young people not being informed or educated enough to be able to vote in a general election, which is a position of such ludicrous symmetry that it's almost perfect. You could almost sell tickets for it. Here's Bobby O'Gammon. Here's Billy Bunch of Numbers. What do you think about 16 or 17-year-olds voting? I don't think they should be allowed to. Oh, but if they do, make sure they use a pen, because if they use a pencil, the World Economic Forum will come along with an enormous rubber and cancel their... I mean, it is quite bizarre, really, that intelligence on the side of people opposed to this sort of policy seems to be in very short supply, while their reason for opposing it is apparently the maturity and or intelligence of others. But also on the broader question of what this does to your view of Keir Starmer and the Labour Party. I like policies that are bold. I like policies that are meaningful. I like policies that are thoughtful. I like policies that deliver things that have been properly explained to me. It's why I like you, Les, although we're waiting for the detail, for the evidence. It's why I like the extension of school meals, free school meals to every primary school child in London, even the ones whose parents can afford it, because it makes a meal in school a universal right. Universal rights are wonderful. Universal rights are brilliant. Universal rights are what distinguishes from totalitarian regimes. The idea that you have a basic right to some fundamental principles, whether it's a roof over your head or a meal in your tummy, is something that all politicians should be dedicated to. But the politicians we were talking about in the first hour are dedicated to the polar opposite position. There should be no universal rights. There should be no government-supplied support. There should be no safety net. It's sink or swim. And people born 3-0 up who think they've scored a hat-trick love the idea of a country that caters almost exclusively to the whims and needs of people who were born 3-0 up. But the idea of extending the vote to 16 and 17-year-olds, how's it gone in Wales and Scotland? If you voted as a 16-year-old or a 17-year-old in Wales or Scotland, then let me know what it meant to you. That's an angle on it that I haven't explored before. The actual extension of the franchise, the sense of being involved, particularly looking at the mess that the grown-ups have made over the last two years. The idea of sitting on the sidelines as a 16 or a 17-year-old in 2016 or 2015. 2019 is a unique election, unfortunately. But what does it mean? What does it actually? Do you take it more seriously, perhaps, than older people? Or by all means, shoot it down for me. Tell me why you are absolutely certain that it would be a disastrous idea. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. Jennifer puts it well. It's the idea of the future leaders of the country being able to vote on the future of the country. What absolute madness. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. And if you hit those numbers now, you will get through. One Labour MP has... It's good that it's a Labour MP that's done it, actually, because Graham Stringer, probably, like most of his colleagues, confident in the majority support of younger people. It is generally the case that younger people vote Labour and then they slowly get their brains boiled by the misery of employment and the machinations of right-wing media and end up veering to the right as they get older. But Graham Stringer has come out and questioned the maturity. He says we have to draw the line somewhere on the voting age, and I simply believe most youngsters at 16 are not mature enough to exercise that right. I'm afraid that were the Labour leader to put this forward, it would smack of party political self-interest on the basis that young people are more likely to vote Labour or Liberal Democrat than Conservative. The second bit is correct. The first bit may be. I mean, you could chalk it up as party political self-interest, but you could also argue that it's an example of politicians or a political party doing something because they believe it to be right, and just as a lucky bonus, it delivers advantage to them. I'm not sure I could make that case with a straight face for the duration of an entire hour. There must be somewhere in Keir Starmer's calculations the knowledge that this is more likely to deliver votes to his party than the main opposition party, than the Conservative Party. But if you think purely and honestly and clearly about the nature of democracy, that can't be a reason to oppose it. The logic of saying you can't give the vote to 16 and 17-year-olds because they're more likely to vote Labour is the same as saying you can't give the vote to 70 and 71-year-olds because they're more likely to vote Tory. Explain the difference to me. If you're going to say you can't give the vote to those people because they're too likely to vote Labour, you could extend that to 18 to 24-year-olds. And if you're going to use a likelihood to vote Labour as a reason to deny someone the franchise, then you have to use also a demonstrable age-based generational likelihood to vote Tory, in which case we would, I don't even know who would end up voting, probably about 5 people aged between 35 and 35 and a half, because you'd have to remove all pensioners. Pensioners demonstrably more likely to vote Conservative. So they can't vote either. You see the madness of the logic behind it, or rather the lack of logic. It's 11:15. I'm sure there are elements of this hardy perennial issue that I have missed, and as ever, I can rely upon you to bring them to the attention of the court. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need to provide your evidence. It's 18 minutes after 11, and, you know, with Liz Truss putting the boot into environmental policies a moment ago. There's so much in my brain. You can't keep it. I don't mean like I'm clever. I just mean there's so much you have to try to remember. Former industrial economist for Shell. I say no more. Should 16 or 17-year-olds get the vote, or should we confine the vote to people who have previously worked as industrial economists for Shell? Is not the question that I'm asking, but yeah, almost. Rebecca's in Glasgow. Rebecca, what made you pick up the phone?
Hi, I've got a 20-year-old son who was eligible to vote from the age of 16. Oh. Now, he was gutted that there were no elections at the time that he was eligible to vote, and he had to wait a couple of years until he could vote. He has never missed a vote in his life. He will always vote. And even before he turned 16, I would sit and listen to him chatting on the Xbox with his friends, and they were engaged in political debate.
Really?
Some voted, some were in favour of Scottish independence, some weren't. But it was a very polite, as far as teens can be in terms of polite conversation.
Oh, so they were mates. They were mates. So it wasn't. Well, exactly. It wasn't a unionist and an independence supporter stumbling across each other with no previous knowledge of it. So it was probably a more civilised debate than much of the official ones.
Have you ever heard teenagers talk to each other over the Xbox? The air is generally blue.
They are a bit profane. I am, but usually only when I'm playing FIFA.
Yeah, but I mean, the thing, they were talking about it in their young years, and they were talking about the environment. And I think this is why young children are more engaged. Young people are more engaged. I mean, my son's turned around to me and said, "You're an ex-gener, Mum. It's your fault that we're in this mess now because you never bothered your backside before." And he's right, because I didn't vote in my 20s.
Do you think independence has engaged his generation? Because it's such a live and vibrant issue.
Yes.
So I suspect there's probably a higher level of political engagement in Scotland than there is in the rest of the United Kingdom.
Possibly.
Among young people.
I think if a 16-year-old is deemed mature enough to have a sexual relationship and potentially become parents, then why on earth should they not be able to vote for the circumstances that will keep them in a, floating above water or not?
Well, I can answer. I mean, the answer to that question is because old right-wing people are frightened of them. That's the only answer to that question. Old right-wing people are frightened of both their democratic power and their insights and education. That is the only answer to the question. It is. I mean, it is a shame.
They were the young ones.
But I don't know what they were like when they were young. But I mean, in terms of why shouldn't they have the vote, it's hard to think of a more pertinent answer. Thank you, Rebecca. Morgan is in Cambridge. Morgan, what would you like to say?
Hello, can you hear me? Hello?
Of course I can hear you. You're on the radio. When they say we're putting you through to the studio, it means that they're putting you through to the studio. Have you ever heard any other caller come on the radio and say, "Hello, can you hear me"?
Well, no, but it's my first time. I'm a bit nervous. Sorry about that.
But you've used the phone before, Morgan.
Yes, I know.
How many times on the phone?
I wasn't sure.
When you ring your mum, do you say, "Hello, can you hear me"?
Well, I'm here to sort of say no is my answer. I don't think they should, but my only reason for that is due to my own limitations when I was that age.
Yes.
So when
as opposed to now.
16, 17, I a bit ashamed to say it, but I was a bit more right wing.
But you're not going to deny people a vote because they're a bit right wing, Morgan.
No, what I'm saying is at that age, I feel like me personally, I was too easily influenced by the media, by some of the lies that these people spread.
Yes.
And it didn't give me the ability to make my own opinion. It was more the opinion of either parents or friends or whoever I was looking at social media at the time. Media. And I feel like now that I'm older and I've been university educated, I have the ability to analyse what they've said, check sources, do all these sort of things, and go, hang on a minute, that's a lie.
Hang on a minute. The problem is, I'm going to interrupt you because I have to, and you put me in a deeply uncomfortable and unfamiliar position, Morgan, but you are fairly close to arguing that only people with a university education should be allowed to vote.
No,
Yes.
Sorry, if I said that, I did not mean that at all. What I meant was, with maturity and with those few extra years under your belt and life experience, you begin to understand that not everything people say is true. Not everything you hear is
lots
factual.
of people understand that at 16 and 17, and lots of people don't understand it at 60 and 65.
I know, but what I'm saying, from my own personal experience, I know anecdotal experience isn't always the best.
Well, it's all we've got. It's all we've got, but it's easily cancelled out with someone else's anecdotal experience.
Yeah, exactly. But what I'm saying is, for me personally, I didn't feel like I had the ability to create a valid opinion at that age, and it might just be me being me, but
no, that's absolutely reasonable. And I think there'll be. I'm how old am I, Keith? I'm 51. I don't think I should have been allowed to vote in the referendum in 2016 because I didn't really know enough about it until afterwards. So
exactly. And what I'm trying to say is when Boris Johnson or someone like him says a lie in 30 seconds, it takes someone else 10 minutes to dismantle it and prove it wrong.
Yes, but loads and loads of people still vote for him.
Nowadays, people haven't got the attention span.
But loads of people. This is an argument against terrible politicians. It's not an argument against letting 16 and 17-year-olds vote. Also, how right-wing were you, Morgan?
Oh, I wasn't horribly right-wing.
Well, how right-wing?
Well,
Farage right-wing?
Oh no, not that bad. I was more sort of unfamiliar with all the horrible things they had done, and I was sort of a bit like, well, some of my family members have voted for them, and I know some people that I like have voted for them. I was like, oh, sure. But then that could just be me. Like I said, being at a younger age and being who I wasn't as switched on as I am now.
No, I like it. It's a good argument. It just reminds us, though, I think, that the age is relatively arbitrary. Because you could, imagine a parallel universe, Morgan, where the age of enfranchisement is 21, which of course it used to be, and we were talking here about lowering it to 18, and you could just as reasonably ring me and say, well, when I was 18 I was a bit of a flump and I believed in this and I hadn't been to university, but now so I don't think we should lower it to 18. I think we should leave it at 21. I don't think any of your very well expressed arguments would not apply equally to discussion about lowering it from 21 to 18.
I think you could be right there, but what I think is that people who are sort of 18 and above, there are a lot more people switched on in that sense than there are at 16. It's just the amount of people who are able to form an opinion is greater, because everyone develops at different rates. I know I did. I'm sure
you're right. I'm still developing, Morgan. I presume we both are. Morgan, can I apologise for being mean to you at the outset of this call? I
totally understand, James. No. Some people ring in here and are absolutely bonkers.
You're very gracious, but that was inappropriate of me. And if I'd known it was your first time call to the programme, I probably wouldn't have picked you up on asking if you can hear me. Is that all right? Am I forgiven?
Oh, of course. I listen to you all the time, James, when I'm working, and it is an absolute pleasure to hear you tear apart some of these idiots.
Well, it's a pleasure to hear you describing your pleasure in me doing that. Thank you, Morgan. And my apologies are sincere. That was a bit inappropriate of me. 26 minutes after 11 is the time. Erin is in Glasgow. Erin, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. I'm another first-time caller, so hello.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you
hear me? I can hear you. Can you hear me? Yes, carry on, Erin.
So I'm just calling in because I just wanted to kind of give the perspective of someone who, obviously from Glasgow, from Scotland. I was one of the first wave of the group of 16-year-olds who got to vote in the Scottish independence.
Right.
So, yeah, really just kind of my thoughts, if I can kind of, encourage anyone or influence anyone, to do it, I would 100% do it. If you are 16, don't ever feel like you don't have the capacity to vote, because you absolutely do. I think for me it was a positive experience, and ever since I've voted since in any election. So it's been a positive one for me, and it definitely gave me a sense of, I suppose, fulfilment and maturity even back then.
Chicken and egg, isn't it, actually? You're probably going to take politics more seriously when you have a proper investment in it.
And I was lucky. I went to a school where politics was quite an open subject and it was discussed a lot, and we were never encouraged to vote a specific way. It was an open discussion of what you could vote for, what your outcome may have been, whether it was yes or no. So it was a healthy discussion, and you had to make a decision based on your own opinion and your own beliefs and values, I suppose.
Yes.
And now for the kind of new wave of 16-year-olds, if we can, as a 16-year-old nowadays, like the previous caller a while ago had said, get married, move out of the home. How can we not be allowed to make
no
those
taxation
decisions?
Without representation, I think, is a slogan that I've heard somewhere.
And something that really struck a chord with me when I was younger, I remember having a conversation with my grandfather at the time who, was like, wow, this is an amazing experience. You get to vote. How do you feel about it? And I remember me and him having a really healthy conversation about it. And one of the things that he said that will stick with me forever was he said, whenever I go to that polling station, I always think of you guys. I never think about myself anymore because my decision ultimately impacts you guys.
Do you know, that's interesting. Really as you said that, Erin, Chris tweeted me to say my worldview is mostly governed by what my kids think, James. They're worried about they're worried about the environment, poverty, war and roadblocks. They're 11 and 9 and on the right side of all the big issues, so 16-year-olds should be allowed to vote. The more investment you've got in the future, the more pertinent your democratic engagement becomes.
Absolutely. And you know what? There is a good feeling and a good sense about going there and ticking the box, whatever box you pick. There is no right or wrong answer. And I think that's an important thing here as well for any kind of young person. Whatever decision you make is not a wrong decision, nor is it a right one. It's what you believe and what you think. Your life is how you've lived it or how you've seen your life. Your parents lived their life or grandparents. They may have gone through the struggle. They may have, you may have lived a really privileged, healthy life, but you've got to go on the opinion on the basis of what you believe in your political, your opinion. And hopefully by this kind of new wave of social media and...
Well, it could go the other way, couldn't it? I mean, it could go the other way when you think about, if you look at the people who were galloping to the defence of Russell Brand this weekend, the sort of Andrew Tates and Elon Musks of this world, who wield epic power, of course, over social media and young people, and the future status of the accusations notwithstanding, that doesn't necessarily paint a positive picture.
Yeah, I mean, even social media was around 10 years ago when I had obviously voted, but it was nowhere near as advanced as what it is now. And even back 10 years ago at school, we were reading politics and, everything like that through either newspapers or watching the news at night. Whereas now you can simply go onto the likes of, say, TikTok or Twitter or whatever that may be to kind of maybe get another opinion or to see
or to get stuck in a rabbit hole. I'm just saying that for balance, not because I think it cancels out your point. I think that you're the second person, or actually the mother of someone from your generation, plus you, equals the most powerful argument so far for political engagement. And, is there a really powerful argument against this other than old right-wing people saying you shouldn't be able to vote because you probably will vote against my interests or my carefully manipulated opinions? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. Someone's listening on catch up. Hi James, says Nell. Farage and Elliott? ? Love Nell. She's answering the question about which of the clowns who turned up for Liz Truss's speech this morning merit entire chapters in my new book, and she's actually right. It is 11:35. We could do a phone-in about who shouldn't be allowed to vote. I mean, some of the evidence that has been thrown up. I can think of people in the House of Commons who shouldn't be allowed to vote in general elections, actually. Some of them almost spectacularly so. But age is an arbitrary barrier to voting. It always has been. Sex was an arbitrary barrier to voting at one point. You wouldn't get a vote if you were a woman. You don't need me to tell you that. Property ownership was an arbitrary barrier to voting at one point. You wouldn't have a vote if you didn't own land. I mean, you can introduce arbitrary barriers wherever you want, but age is perhaps the least controversial, and 18 is an improvement upon 21. 16, many would argue, is an improvement upon 18, but it doesn't follow that 5 would be an improvement upon 16. I was a great fan of school elections when my children were at primary school, and I was always struck by how often the teachers failed to properly police proceedings because the kid who was privately promising free sweets for everybody would often win. Not as they got a little bit further up the school ladder, but certainly in the early years when kids perhaps wouldn't stop to question whether or not the person seeking their vote would be in a position to give everybody in the class a tube of Smarties in the event of being elected putative primary school prime minister. I don't know, but you could get all the votes from year 6, even if you were struggling to get them from year 10. And of course, some of those kids grew up to vote for Brexit because Nigel Farage promised them free sweets, or Boris Johnson promised them sunlit uplands, and that doesn't mean that they shouldn't have had a vote then, or that they shouldn't have a vote now. But I can't see currently any what's the word I'm looking for? Really powerful arguments against lowering the voting age, except that you're worried that the people who get the vote might vote in a way you don't like. And if I'm wrong, you know what to do. 0345 6060 973. And if I'm right, then help me put more flesh upon the bones of my rectitude, so that people listening, labouring under the illusion that 16, 17, it's like a second hand on a clock. You know, on the day of an election, there'll be some people who are hours away from being 18 or hours away from being 16. I just mentioned that to show you how arbitrary it is. But if we're going to have arbitrary criteria in place for this sort of thing, then what is the difference between 18 and 16? 0345 6060 973. Joseph is in Southampton. Joseph, what would you like to say?
Good morning. In your introduction this morning, you mentioned a Labour MP stating they have to draw the line somewhere at an age.
Yes.
Well, they did that. The Mental Capacity Act in 2005 states that from the age of 16, we are presumed to have capacity to make our own decisions. So, for me,
I didn't know that. Every day's a school day, Joseph. Thank you for that. That's a very powerful piece of evidence.
Yep, I think that's very important. If people think the opposite, they should be older. There's evidence within psychology that not until the age of 25 or so are we fully able to make our own decisions.
Yes.
But that's not in the law. I mean, but that is an argument the other way. But the law is 16 at the moment for presuming someone has capacity until proven otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, you know, there is variation, isn't there? The age at which you can drive a car is different from the age at which you're deemed to have mental capacity to, the legislation you refer to make your own decisions. So you can join the army but not get sent to war. You can have sex but not get married without your parents' permission. So there are various arbitrary cut-off points for age. So it's not quite, you don't quite close the conversation down by bringing the capacity to make your own decisions into proceedings, I don't think.
No, but it's presuming you can weigh up enough information to make decisions, and then the voters essentially trying to do that, then you could say that that's where it is. I don't understand the history around the other ones.
No.
They're clearly complicated.
No,
but
on this one, this is fairly straightforward, and therefore it's. And is it good politics? I mean, the idea that you and I will never know whether Keir Starmer is driven by a desire to hoover up the majority of the 1.5 million votes that will be liberated by this legislation, or whether he has a deep ideological commitment to the idea of extending the franchise. And quite interestingly, as Scott, someone pointed out in a text that I've lost, it means that people will be in full-time, here it is, from Tom, changing the voting age to 16 means everyone's first chance to vote, not quite everyone, Tom, because the electoral cycle, will be whilst they're in full-time education. This will drive turnout because educational institutions will need to make provision and remind students to vote and explain how to vote. Tom in Rochdale, good politics or actually ideologically driven, do you think?
Well, I think that for me, if you look at the 5-year cycle for being in government, at 16 you have then your A-levels in 2 years, then a degree if you go to university or further development and skills, and then your first job. Those 5 years are essential for the rest of your life. And you probably have more vested in that government than probably almost anyone else in the country, actually, for your life's turnout.
I think you're actually right. It's insane when you think about what is denied to people who are at their most formative and relevant. Thank you, Joseph. I particularly like the reference to the 2005 Law of Mental Capacity Act. 11:40, 20 to 12 is the time. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. Ken in Somerset wonders whether lowering the voting age made any noticeable difference in Scotland or Wales. Well, to what? To the results? I suppose you'd have to point out Wales has a Labour leader. Scotland has a SNP leader for now. I guess there's no counterfactual, is there, where you could say if they hadn't lowered the vote to 16, then other people would be in power. Karen is in Glasgow. Karen, what would you like to say? Hello, Karen.
I am parent to a 15-year-old. He is heavily interested in politics.
Yes.
And that's something that he's taken on himself. We don't watch television in our house, not through any strict means or anything like that. It's just not something that we do.
Because you watch streaming services?
Yes. Yeah. And we don't buy newspapers, so any information he gets in politics is through his own searching.
Okay.
And it's something that him and his friend group have been interested in. And as one of your other callers says, I think in Scotland it's definitely been influenced by the independence movement.
Yes.
And it's not, one-sided in that. The discussions that they have been, very rounded.
It's such a big... I wonder whether, as you get older, unless someone offers you up something really juicy, like, unfortunately in this country in the last 10 years, the only juicy thing the electorate has been offered, or part of the electorate has been offered, is the chance to keep foreigners out or stop people coming here.
Yeah.
But the rest of the time, we don't feel that it makes that much difference. We're not. I mean, you don't really read, but something as big as Scotland will no longer be ruled from London, or Scotland will no longer be part of the United Kingdom. Something really big like that brings home the importance of democracy.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing that I've noticed with them is, well, for me, myself, when I was the age that my son is, when he first sort of started taking an interest in these things, I mean, I didn't vote till I was in my late 20s for the first time. And obviously, when I was like his age at school, I mean, I knew who the Prime Minister was. I knew there was elections. I couldn't have told you who the political parties were. I'm just a bit younger than yourself. I couldn't have told you any of that. And I think, just like your last caller said, if the voting was to be 16 and the schools had an obligation in that they had to be able to inform on how the political system worked, not in any sort of direct means of informing them of political sides and whatnot, but just in a general overview, I think it would open a few eyes in that...
No, but of course it would. And maybe that's what the opponents to it are worried about.
They don't want, exactly.
I would go so far as to say that if the most rabidly convinced opponent of extending the vote to 16 and 17-year-olds would get his backside handed to him in a jiffy bag by the average politically engaged 16 and 17-year-old on the very simple question of whether or not I should have a vote and you shouldn't.
Absolutely. But my other thing that I think, it's these children at the moment, and technically, my son's still a child, he's 15 at the moment, these are the people that have to live with the consequences of these decisions and these votes. I mean, I was a child when Margaret Thatcher was the Prime Minister, and we're still living with the consequences of her reign. And, in 40 years' time, we're still going to be living with the consequences of Boris Johnson and Liz Truss.
Yes, we are. And
they would have had... going to be when my child possibly has children. So these things last a long, long time, and the consequences last a long, long time. So why should these 16-year-olds have to suffer when there is an opportunity for them to have their voice?
Yes. Well, I mean, we are in danger of reaching consensus. Thank goodness for Morgan, who was singing from the opposite hymn sheet on the grounds of his own personal development, having kicked in rather later in life than 16 or 17. I'm really struck by the number of callers coming in from Scotland as well, because that really speaks to engagement as a consequence of enfranchisement. So I think independence would have driven a level of political engagement lacking from their peers south of the border for the very simple reason, well, actually, no, you'd have thought, but Brexit... You'd have thought Brexit might have done that as well. Younger people much more likely to understand the idiocy of Brexit, perhaps, than older people, because A, they're less spooked by anti-immigrant propaganda, and B, they understand the size of the world, and the idea of shrinking your role in it would be sillier to them, I think, than to their grandparents. But I think there is something peculiar to Scotland, just judging by the phones today, about young people in Scotland A, have had the franchise for a longer time, and B, have therefore become more politically engaged, or the question of independence is so big and so live and so real and so immediately comprehensible that it brings the power of a vote home in a way that is perhaps not as immediately obvious elsewhere in the United Kingdom. If you want to join the conversation, you know what to do. 0345 6060 973. I think it becomes like a Rosetta Stone sometimes. I'm not a fan of simplism, oversimplifying things. But sometimes if you distill, think of it as a distillation rather than an oversimplification. If you see the Liz Truss outlook or the Tufton Street ideology, for want of a better word, if you see it as a genuine belief or simply a self-interested determination, or both, I guess one might lead into the other. You don't want to admit to yourself that it's a self-interested determination, so you eventually end up persuading yourself that it's a genuine belief. That rich people or capital, wealth, business owners, however you want to term it, should be able to do whatever they want, and that any form of regulation or scrutiny or accountability or wealth distribution is fundamentally wrong and fundamentally unfair. The only way that a society can really thrive and flourish is if money and the possessors of the money are free to do whatever they want, and labour, i.e. the workers, are mere tools or cattle to be herded according to the whims of their owners. Then you end up believing what Liz Truss professes to believe. But I tell you what, get that in your head, get that Rosetta Stone in your head. It's all about doing whatever the rich people want, whatever capital wants, whatever wealth wants, and then everything else makes sense, you see. So have a little listen to this, which is Liz Truss earlier today, talking, I think, about Mark Carney. I haven't listened to it in full myself, but listen to it through the lens of that explanation of where this madness comes from. Wealth / capital should be free to do whatever it wants, and anyone who interferes with that is the enemy.
Interest rates were going to go up anyway. I think the real failure was not to tell people years and years ago that these interest rates were artificially low. That was the problem. We gave people an expectation that cheap money would go on forever, and then when the interest rates went up, there was a problem. But this really leads me nicely on to Mark Carney. And I talked about the 25-year economic consensus. Well, part of that has been the central banks. And I do think they have played an important role in pumping the system full of money, keeping interest rates artificially low, essentially enabling this excessive government spending to take place. And I'm afraid there's quite a lot of finger-pointing going on from people like Mark Carney because they don't want to admit their culpability or the culpability of their central banking associates in this. And I, again, think, of course, politicians should be held accountable and responsible for what we do, but when there are people with significant power, I don't feel that the same questions are necessarily asked about them. And, Mark Carney is part of the 25-year economic consensus that has led to low growth across the Western world. And, no doubt he's defensive about that.
Funny. If Mark Carney was worried that his criticisms of Liz Truss hadn't landed, it was very gracious of her to prove completely that they had. Anyway, 11:53 is the time. Back to votes for 16-year-olds. George is in Preston. George, what would you like to say?
Hello, James.
Hello, George.
It's basically quite funny, this conversation, because I was actually thinking about this only yesterday. When I was 16, I'm 23 now, so I was 16 in the 2016 Brexit referendum.
Yeah. So you can never forget your age, can you? Because you were born in 2000. It's like my wedding anniversary, but 10 years previously. 2010.
It's quite funny because on the actual day of the referendum, it was my high school prom, and I remember just being glued to my phone going, oh my God, that's gone leaving, oh no.
Yes.
And all my friends were like, come and have fun. And I was like, no, this is more important. But anyway, that was the year I started college in the September of 2016, and I did do politics and economics. And most people at my college were really engaged in the political discussion of that time, which, of course, was dominated by Brexit and the inability by Theresa May to get a deal through. And I just remember being in the sixth form common room, and everybody will be talking about it, whether they did politics or not.
Right.
And I do think that now young people are more engaged in politics than ever before, because we can see what's going on with the country and the actual inability of our leaders to actually do anything about the issues that affect us.
Yes.
I do think that 16-year-olds are not naive, and those that aren't interested in politics simply won't vote. So the argument going that, 16-year-olds aren't informed enough, well, if they're not informed enough, they won't vote. And those that are informed will.
I guess so. I mean, I suppose Morgan's point would be that you might have been misinformed, and then you would go out and vote.
Yeah, I mean, there is obviously a lot of.
But that applies to all age groups. That applies to all age groups.
Oh yeah, I mean, my granddad actually subscribed to the view that the EU won't let us have bendy bananas. I mean,
bless him.
He was a lifelong Labour man, and I just could not get into my head. Get into his head. I mean, that he's being fed a pack of lies. And I mean, it's interesting listening to the Liz Truss thing this morning, because I forgot who said that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting the same results. I mean, it's just beggars belief that people of my age then didn't get to have a voice in something that's affecting us now. Brexit's affecting me.
Yes.
I want to travel abroad now, and it's harder to do that. I buy a lot of things from Germany in the EU, and I have to pay sky high.
It's crazy, isn't it? It's still underreported, I think, George, for fairly obvious reasons. But the dam has to break at some point about the actual, not the status quo, not things haven't improved as we were promised they would, but things have got measurably worse, as of course we were warned they would by the other side. It's criminally, chronically underreported.
Yeah. I mean, we spoke a couple of weeks ago. I was the one that rang in about the speed of records, and obviously, I do buy a lot of parts from Europe to repair my things, and I just
you're the Wurlitzer. You play the Wurlitzer, don't you?
Yeah,
love it.
And I just feel that this argument that 16-year-olds aren't really politically engaged. I mean, I heard some of the callers that said that their children have been on the Xbox and things like that. I think that's good for democracy.
Yeah,
the more democracy we have is surely a good thing.
Well, depends what you want. Whether you want government sort of by the people of the people for the people, or whether you actually pretend that you want that while shouting. I mean, the people who shout loudest about democracy and the will of the people are largely the ones supportive of elections or referendums where people were persuaded of things that are categorically not true, like your granddad. I mean, is that proper democracy? If someone casts a vote in the EU referendum because they believe some bilge about bananas, that's not proper democracy, either under the Greek definition of the word or the widespread understanding of what it means. An informed electorate casting votes is the democratic model. You persuade everybody that they get a free unicorn. We're back to primary school. You tell all the kids you're going to get a free bag of sweets. Whether you get the free bag of sweets or not, democracy has been undermined. If you don't get the free bag of sweets, it's been undermined even more than it would have been if you did get the free bag of sweets. Thank you, George. Louise is in Petherton. Louise, what would you like to say?
Hello.
Hello, Louise.
First-time caller.
Welcome.
Long listener to your show. Love it.
Thank you.
I'm a youth worker.
A youth worker. I think the line cut out a bit there. A youth worker, yes.
Yeah, and I work with young people aged 13 to 18.
Right, you are.
And our young people where I work are very, very politically aware, to the point is they formed their own youth parish council with support from us. And they give feedback to the parish councils about issues that affect young people. They also have stood in front of the planning committees of our unitary council in Somerset and have spoken about planning and how it affects the environment and things like that. So a lot of young people are very, very politically aware. Some of them are only 13, some of them are 17.
Yes.
But I think that quite a lot of young people now actually are interested in politics, and I think they should be able to vote.
And the more you extend the franchise, the more interested they will be. Very interested. I don't know why I haven't had more calls from Wales. I think the franchise was extended in Scotland before it was in Wales, and they haven't had such a powerful moment as the independence referendum. But it's so interesting, just so simple to see that forming the parish council youth group is going to have increased. The ones that were, say, on a 4 out of 10 level of interest before you did that will now be a 6 or a 7 because they feel engaged, they feel pertinent, relevant, they feel relevant.
Yeah, most definitely. They feel they're listened to and they're a voice for all the other young people that live within the community that they're based.
I love it. No, I love it. I do. Louise, thank you. Thank you for the work that you do as well. It's coming up to 12 noon. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I think what we'll do next is a bit of a swerve. I want to have a conversation about Russell Brand's the world that he has created, if you like, or this, because it's not just him, is it? A lot of the people queuing up to defend him, even before these accusations and allegations had been aired, seem to subscribe to a weird bunch of conspiracy theories. I saw a brilliant explanation as to why that is. I think it was Ian Dunt earlier, just saying, of course, there's an overlap between lockdown skepticism, pro-Trump sentiment, attacks on the blob. Once you believe one conspiracy theory, you suffer a form of epistemological breakdown. But we're not going to talk about that next. 12:03 is the time. Please keep this anonymous. All right then, Dave. He's not called Dave. That's quite. I thought that was right. Do you not think that's quite funny? All right. I know a guy that voted for Boris Johnson and then was totally shocked when Boris Johnson did what he's been doing all his life. The guy was a detective, James, which was worrying to say the least. He gets a vote, but your previous caller didn't. It's a very good point. I got to talk about something completely different now, and it's a subject very close to my heart. So 30 MPs and peers have warned the Education Secretary, Gillian Keegan, not about the imminent collapse of various schools, but about the paucity of religious education in schools. They describe it as tokenistic or non-existent. They write, and I want you to pay attention to this is not about religion. This is about religious education. They are two very, very different things. It's not a phone-in about whether or not believing in God is evidence of mental frailty or the only thing that gets you through the day. All right, it's a conversation about religious education. And as with many topics that come under our microscope on this programme, your age is going to be quite pertinent to what you think is meant by that phrase. And I don't know how many of the 30 MPs and peers that have written to the Education Secretary will actually have much knowledge of what is taught in schools today under the banner of religious education, but many people listening to this programme will. And in fact, when we look at the list, we'll probably get a fairly clear idea of how, what's the word for which I seek, of how informed this mini campaign actually is. But here is what they say. RE, as in religious education, helps children take their place in society, supports them in being effective and engaged in the workplace, their community, and in discussing and debating issues related to religion and belief. They claim that some schools, some children now, receive either tokenistic RE or none at all, leaving school without the knowledge and understanding of their own worldviews or others necessary for life in modern Britain. And they conclude that children in that category are consequentially ill-prepared to play their part in our complex religious and non-religious society with all the opportunities created by its diversity. And an interesting mix of people have signed the letter, including Sir Robert Buckland, Peter Bottomley, the Right Reverend Lord Bishop of Durham, and Paul Boateng, or now Lord Boateng, former Chief Secretary to the Treasury. So an interesting mix of men. I don't know whether there are any women on the list. 12:06 is the time. And an interesting question for us to ponder together. I think it's really important, actually. One of the reasons why I'm so good at dismantling homophobes who ring in to claim that there's a scriptural basis for discriminating against gay people is because of my understanding of the Bible. I can see that a world in which religious education is no longer necessary might be desirable, and I can see that arguing that religious education is necessary in order to properly and in an informed fashion combat religious bigotry is not really the best argument in history, but it's not a bad one. But I'm interested in things that go beyond that sort of binary opposition. The benefits of religious education. So we'll begin with whether or not you got any. 0345 6060 973. What is the score on the ground now? Teachers will be particularly well placed to answer this question. Has religious education been pushed into the background by the prioritisation of other disciplines? Is it a complete lottery, really, depending on what school you go to, whether you get a sort of full and detailed religious education or close to none at all? I genuinely don't know. I'm trying to think about my own children, but I've got to be honest with you. It's not. I don't even know if crikey, that's very bad parenting on my part. Whereas for my generation, and for me in particular, it was hugely important, partly because I was taught for much of my life by nuns and monks. But I did an A-level in religious education a year early because it was compulsory at my school. It wasn't a mark of precociousness or particular intelligence. And I think of all the A-levels I did, my others were in history, English and politics, of all the A-levels I did, I think the religious education one might be the one I draw on most in my job. Having understanding of other religions, not a deep understanding, but having an understanding of conflict within Christianity, not just the Reformation, but things like the Oxford movement in the 19th century, which, proved profoundly important to the social development of the country. On the other hand, I understand messages like this from Page, who says, keep religion out of schools. It's dangerous. Christian nationalists in America are banning books now and determining what should be taught. I want to know what you think, based upon experience, I think, and hopefully some evidence. So should children be taught, two questions, should children be taught education, taught religious education in their schools? And the second question then becomes, what do you think they should be taught? Were you taught anything dangerous in religious education at school? Have I ever told you the story about AIDS that we were told by a monk who'd taken a vow of celibacy? So this was in religious education stroke, it's called PHE, is it, these days? But this is going back 35 years. And he told us a story about AIDS in a religious education class that I must have shared with you before. I must have done. He said that there was a lad in the school a few years ago. He's a real superstar. And he went away to university. I can't believe this happened, actually. This would be 1987, okay? Second year at school. He went away to university and he fell in love with a girl who'd had a previous boyfriend. So she'd had sex before, but he never had. And he lost his virginity to his girlfriend. And then he went home for the school holidays and he borrowed his dad's razor. Can you see where this is going? And he shaved with his dad's razor and he accidentally cut himself. And then his dad shaved with the same razor and he accidentally cut himself. And then his dad had sex with his mum and now they're all dead of AIDS. That was a religious education class at my monastic Catholic boarding school in 1987 in this country. Warning us against sex, I think. Well, obviously, warning us against extramarital sex. And that would be filed under religious education. But it is no longer 1987. It is now 2023. Breaking news. And I can't imagine for a minute, Page's protestations notwithstanding, I'm not going to take Bible Belt America as the example of the only way in which religious education can unfold in schools. Being taught about the development of one thing that I took away from my religious education, oddly, despite being raised a Christian and having gone through periods of fairly deep faith in my life, however daft that sounds to secularists or more modern listeners, one of the things I took away from it was the arbitrary nature of religion, the geographical accident of whatever it may be you believe, the geographical and socio-economic accident. So, especially as an adopted person, what if I'd been adopted by a Jewish family and I'd been raised with as much attention to the Jewish faith as I was raised with attention to the Catholic faith? What if I'd been adopted by a Muslim family or an atheist family? It is, such an area of nurture as opposed to nature that what it taught me was the danger of hierarchy. You know, the danger of saying that the fundamental message of all religions essentially would be excellent to each other. There are exceptions to that, but generally speaking, be excellent to each other is a fairly good message for life, isn't it? As things get messy, things get ugly when you start saying that you're going to go to hell if you do that, whereas I'm going to go to heaven because that's bad, man. That doesn't really fit with any scriptural support. Well, it does with some, but it's not the be-all and end-all of religious instruction. There's a good distinction. The difference between religious instruction and religious education is that you are being educated about religions as opposed to you are being instructed on religious grounds. Religious instruction scares the bejesus out of me, if you pardon the pun, because that's where the madness lies. That's where the book burning goes. That's where the epic moral hypocrisy leads us. That's where the homophobia springs up, or the sexism. This, again, it's an American phenomenon, the sort of trad wife movement that sees women as essentially homemakers and baby producers, while the man is the protector, the patriarch, and also the provider. It's just a mad Victorian approach to relations and approach to life and society, but it's still out there. That would involve religious instruction. Religious education would involve teaching children that there's no basis for this ludicrous belief. And actually, other religions might be just as oppressive, which proves that it's not unique to Christianity. I guess what I'm doing is a bit dissonant. So I think religious education is a good thing because I think it did me quite a lot of good. But systems which examine people at the end of the year and don't have any coursework in them did me quite a lot of good as well. It suited my skill set. It doesn't mean that that is the best system for an entire school to adopt. Kids who work really, really hard all year but have a panic attack before every exam they go to are horribly let down by the system I've just described. So what I need you to do for me is take a step back and explain to a skeptic what is the value of religious education, or conversely, explain to a convert why they're wrong. Explain to me why you don't think religious education has any place in schools in 2023. 0345 6060 973. Brian in Dulwich asks, James, was that warning from the monk about not shaving? Is that the reason for your beard? No, that's my chin, actually. 12. It's coming up to 12:15. The key question here is, should we be teaching more religious education in schools, or should we be trying to wipe it out altogether? Hit the numbers now, you will get through. 0345 6060 973. It is 12:17. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where the question of whether or not children, school children, should receive more, less, or no religious education will concern us until 1 o'clock today, with a couple of amusing diversions, including some rather beautiful footage from the Invictus Games this weekend, which, because it is Prince Harry's brainchild and mission, won't have received the amount of coverage in the UK media that it frankly should have done. But the rest of the world was paying attention, and it was an incredibly beautiful event culminating in a ceremony where he spoke with, I think, epic emotional literacy. I think that's what frightens people, partly. Not just the fact that he married a woman of colour, which obviously scares the life out of some people who sadly seem to be running newspapers. But the emotional literacy that he speaks with, it's very difficult to do that when someone demonstrates epic emotional literacy and you are living in a state of denial about your own repression. Very, very difficult not to lash out. I would have done once. The angrier you are about Prince Harry, it's highly likely, if it's not racism, it's highly likely that it's projection. The angrier you are about Prince Harry, the more subconsciously heartbroken you are at your own emotional, I want a better word than illiteracy, like being crippled, your own emotional stuntedness. That's a good word. The angrier you are about Prince Harry, if it's got nothing to do with the fact that he married a woman of colour, then the more haunted you are by your own emotional stuntedness. That would be my theory, and I'll provide more evidence to back it up shortly. But first, religious education. Lisa is in Southampton. Lisa, what would you like to say?
Yeah, I come at this from two different angles. You can tell by my accent. I've been on before. I'm from California, and I grew up without any religious education in school.
Okay.
But I have taught RE I'm retired now. I still occasionally teach it, but I've taught it for 20 years.
Oh, wow.
And I've also taught geography and citizenship, and doing RE actually helps you in other subjects because you're learning about different cultures, religious practices, beliefs, and I think it makes you a more well-rounded person.
Yes, definitely. And I mean, it's obvious as well. The other subjects with which it would help, everything from literature to history and and a lot in between. Just out of interest, how did you end up not being taught it yourself and then teaching it?
In America, it's separation of church and state, and you can't teach religious education in any American school.
I didn't know that.
Unless you are in a faith school, like a Catholic school or something like that, then obviously religion is taught. But no, it is against the law, and there will not be any religious education in any school.
So where did you get into it, for want of a better phrase?
I literally, at the age of 46, I wanted to use my degree. I wanted to become a teacher, and they were absolutely. I live near Southampton, and Southampton University. They said we've got a space for 10 RE teachers. We're desperately short, and I just said, okay, I'll teach RE. And I was a sociology major at university, and I always had an interest in religion, and I thought, well, why not? So I taught RE.
I can see why. We've already mapped the distinction between religious instruction, which we could describe as indoctrination, couldn't we, quite literally, and religious education. But you need, for your theory to hold, you need to be teaching about almost all religions, don't you? But at Key Stage 3, we do teach about all religions. We teach the 6 major religions, and in some schools, they may teach religion, non-mainstream religion. Yeah. Like my own religion, I grew up in the Baha'i faith. Wow. And they, in some areas in the UK, they have taught the Baha'i faith, but most of the time they don't. So it's usually the 6 major religions. And then in Key Stage 4, you specialize. I've taught Islam, Hinduism, and Christianity at Key Stage 4, GCSE. And then you get really into the beliefs, practices, and then the themes, which is how do Catholics feel about abortion, how do Hindus feel about abortion, and you start to get into actually themes, which is the other part of the paper. So if you're talking about key stages, then these politicians claiming that the teaching is tokenistic and in some schools they're not getting any at all, possibly need to do a bit more homework, or not?
Key Stage 3, you will go to most schools, and they may water it down a bit.
Right.
They may, I taught PSHE as well, and some schools have completely thrown that out, which is ridiculous. But in America, though, I'm very liberal, and so I'm obviously very liberal, but a lot of my friends that are liberal, they think that church and state, they hate RE being taught. But on this, because they think it's a Bible Belt Christian bashing type
they
stuff.
Think it's inculcation. They think it's instruction rather than education.
Exactly.
I would have thought if you're being taught comparative religion, it would become harder with every class to cling on to the notion of I'm going to heaven because of what I was born into, and you're not, despite being religious.
But look at September 11th. September 11th, there were a lot of Americans that felt, obviously, because the people that were bombing the Twin Towers were from Saudi Arabia and they were Muslim, they thought every Muslim, we know the backlash against Islam. And I've taught Islam, and it's incredible religion. It's a lovely religion. And
just for balance, Billy Buncher numbers with a picture of a bulldog on Twitter would disagree with you there.
Well, but also they thought Hindus, Sikhs, and Muslims were all the same.
Of course. And that is a consequence of not teaching religion in schools.
They didn't know the difference.
Oh, I'd never thought of it like that. I mean, that should be the beginning and the end of it, shouldn't it? But of course it won't be, because the same ignorance leads to Muslim bans and lets complete monsters into the White House.
You were talking about banning the books.
Yes.
I just feel the irony of not having to close down, like in Tennessee, any clubs where somebody is trans or is cross-dressing or they want to close those down. But yet they want to say To Kill a Mockingbird. It just has to be banned. I just don't get it. I just don't get it.
I'm going to embarrass myself now. I've only got 5.
5 what?
Major religions.
Now there's Buddhism, Sikhism, Judaism, Christianity, Hinduism, and
Islam.
And Islam.
I forgot to write one down. I knew I had all of those written down. But
my son's girlfriend, her parents are from the Punjab, and they're Sikhs.
Yes.
And it'll be great when I get to meet them because I can go to the Gurdwara. I know all about Sikhism. I love Sikhism. And to me, that's great that my, son's girlfriend, family, I know
what
something.
you do is you remind us that religions, in their essence, are philosophies, and they're fairly good philosophies. They're good models for living. Of course, when you introduce the notion that if you don't believe what I profess to believe, then you go to hell, that's when all the problems start, or I have the right to tell you what to do. But, it was Bill, the seventh major religion, of course, is Bill and Ted, and be excellent to each other, which I like to feel combines elements of the other six. Lisa, that was lovely. Thank you. Can I ask you, I think I asked you this last time, I still haven't sold out in Southampton, Lisa. I've sold out in London, I've sold out in Birmingham, I've sold out in Northampton.
Well, if you come down here and I'm not, I would definitely come, because and even my sons, you're one of our favorite presenters on any of the stations.
You've got to spread the word more. You've got to, because it's not happening. I've still got a few tickets to shift in Southampton. I've sold out Norwich. Oh, it's crazy. I've sold out Manchester. I can't sell out Southampton for love or money. Lisa, thank you. Clark's in Scarborough. I'm not playing Scarborough. I've got into quite a lot of trouble with family friends for not having any gigs in Yorkshire, but I'm trying to rectify it. Clark, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello,
first of all, I am absolutely thrilled that you're talking about this subject. So I did my BA and my MA in theology and religious studies.
Oh, wow.
And one of the questions I've been asked forever since really is why? What's the importance of it? It's all fairy tales, it's all nonsense, all this kind of thing.
Yes.
And I cannot stress just how important teaching about religions is in any walk of life. And I think for me, kind of similar to what your previous caller said, I think 9/11 had such a huge impact on public discourse around religion. And I think there's so much religious illiteracy out there that, people think that, all Muslims believe X, Y, Z, all Christians believe X, Y, Z. And there's
and also, by actually adding to you and the previous caller, you can, without having really good religious education, you can persuade people to fly planes into the World Trade Center because they think they'll go to heaven and be rewarded with 30 virgins or whatever madness it was.
Precisely.
So that would be a consequence of religious instruction as opposed to religious education.
Precisely. And, I spent 3 years working in state secondary education because my original aim was to teach religious studies.
Right.
And, I was talking to year 8 kids, so they must have been around 12 or 13, and I was kind of involved with an RE lesson. And the enthusiasm that they showed for, tackling some of these big kind of existential philosophical questions was really inspiring. And it's not all about, these are the different denominations of Christianity. These are what, this is what Catholics think about X, Y, Z. There's so much more kind of philosophy that goes on in, from my experience of working in education. And these skills are so important,
yes.
Critical thinking, you only have to look at the political world that we live in, and the lack of people's ability to think critically about the things that they're being told is, I could talk to you about this for hours.
Are you still teaching?
No, I'm not. I had a rather bad experience with a student that kind of put me off doing my teacher training. So, but it's okay. It's
sorry
fine.
to hear that, but you retain your passion for the subject.
Oh, absolutely.
Same here, actually. I did a degree in philosophy and an A-level in religious studies, but I don't have a master's. But for me, the links between the two, it's mad though, isn't it? Really, because you say religious, and people think devout. Right.
Yes.
But that is, in many ways, it's the opposite. The more religious education you have, the more rounded your worldview will be, rather than narrow, blinkered, and doctrinal.
Yep. Absolutely. And I know I've in the last couple of years I've become a Unitarian.
Okay.
And you speak to people about, I'm a Unitarian. Oh, what's that? They have no idea. And it's a denomination of free, liberal, progressive Christians. But people
sounds a bit woke, Clark.
Well, I know. I am a fully signed up member of the TOEFL Eating Woke
Church of Woke. Yes, same here.
But But people think, if I say I'm a Christian, they instantly think that I believe that the world was created in 6 days, that, the world is only 3,000 years old, and that,
that's how do you fix that?
Homosexuality is an abomination. And it's education. And we live in a world where religion, although it's dwindling, it still plays such an enormous part in people's lives. People's ignorance to it, the only way that you can combat that is through education. And I think people need to understand the differences between, as you say, religious instruction and religious education or religious studies.
And that's got to be a good thing. And I don't know that the people calling for more religious education in schools are necessarily drawing the distinction between education and instruction as starkly as you and I would. Clark, thank you. It is, and take care as well. I sense that Clark might have pulled over to make that call, for which we're always particularly grateful. I think Darren gets a little... Does Darren get a ticket for Idiot's Corner today? I'll let you decide. Darren has texted to say, religion and critical thinking in the same sentence, priceless. So, Darren, how would you describe the process by which you arrived at the idea that religion was bunkum? How would you describe the thought processes that led you to the conclusion that religious was a load? Because I know a lot of people would call it critical thinking, but you couldn't explain the role that critical thinking had played in your thinking about religion unless you use the phrase critical thinking. And yet you're taking the mickey out of the words religion and critical thinking appearing in the same sentence. Also, it's religious education and critical thinking that have appeared in the same sentence. It's a rare Idiot's Corner, that, because I don't know that you realise how silly... Well, no one ever does, do they? But I'm going to put you in Idiot's Corner, mate. It's only 12:31, so you'll be out in 29 minutes. It's more of a sin bin than a sentence. But, come on, do better. 12:34 is the time. Speaking of philosophy, which our last caller was a wonderful and articulate advocate of, I find myself in the curious philosophical condition this morning of complaining about the attention being given to Liz Truss while giving Liz Truss attention. It's almost metaphysical. Well, we won't make a habit of it, is all I can say to you, but we will do it a bit more first. And that's largely because LBC's highly respected reporter Henry Riley has been in attendance at this curious speech at the Institute for Government and is keen to share his impressions. Henry, good morning. Good afternoon.
Yes, good afternoon, James. Liz Truss sort of coming out it's probably easier to say who she didn't blame, actually, for her economic policies from last year. In attendance, just to give you the backdrop, James, were Nigel Farage, Lord Frost, Patrick Mimford, Julian Jessup from the IEA, Sirocco Forte, the businessman, Matthew Elliott, who was the CEO of Vote Leave, and the former Brexit Party MEP Lance Foreman.
Good Lord.
She started off with a joke, saying it was a more relaxing September this year compared to last year. She plugged her new book on 3 occasions, which is out.
That plug their books all the time.
Which is out in April. I didn't ask if she was around for full disclosure, actually. I got the sense she might not be invited. It felt really, James, like the sort of trial of Liz Truss. When it came to questioning, it really did sort of heat up the tension in the room. It's now eerily quiet outside the Institute for Government. And she was very clear. It was the reaction, not the policy, that was the problem with her mini budget. Now, in terms of who was to blame, James, firstly, the BBC were to blame. Yep. Faisal Islam, their economics editor, asked a question about bond markets, and she actually turned it on its head and said that whenever she watches the BBC, they're far too easy to give left-wing activists and left-wing think tankers, as she described it, an easy ride.
Did she name any left-wing think tank?
She didn't, no.
Right.
She didn't on that occasion.
Okay.
Various people asked her whether she would apologise for her mini budget, which led to various groans in the audience from some of those individuals that I referenced earlier as well. And she said the media is obsessed with gossip rather than core issues. Who else is to blame? Wokery in government institutions. She labelled it as the woke diversity brigade. That's an exact quote.
Okay. Did she provide any examples?
She said that some civil servants she dealt with were sort of belonging to that camp.
But did she tell you what she meant by the word?
No, didn't expand on that. Okay. But that was a curious backdrop, James, because the Institute for Government is made up of civil servants, former civil servants, so it didn't go down particularly well among some of the people in the room. She said the Labour Party want to copy and paste Joe Biden. And then lastly, Peter Walker from The Guardian used the word crash the economy, which she refuted and said that he should stop reading from a Labour Party press release. Her main message was that we can make Britain grow again. In terms of the sort of backdrop as well, that was put to her about comments from Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of England. Just to remind your listeners, James, he described it, of course, as not Singapore on Thames, but Argentina on the Channel.
Yes.
And Liz Truss very clear that she's not a big fan of Mr. Carney. She said he's no doubt defensive about his establishment's record of economic failure. He's part of the 25-year economic consensus that has led to a stagnant Britain and stagnant living standards. And she said also that Rishi Sunak, she sort of hinted that he was part of the same anti-growth coalition. You referenced that I'm a well-respected journalist, James. I did get a chance to ask a question, highly respected LBC journalist. I did ask a question of Liz Truss about the triple lock on pensions. She was saying in the long term it's unsustainable, and did also confirm she'd be causing a bit of mischief at Conservative Party conference. You spoke, Liz, about raising the retirement age. I wondered on the pensions triple lock if you felt it was sustainable in the long term, and will you be going to the Conservative Party conference next month?
On this question about pensions, so what I don't want to do is see current pensioners penalised who are retired. We can't leave them in the lurch. But over the longer term, we definitely need to raise the retirement age. And we also need to look at how to deliver pensions better, because I don't think the current system works as well as it should do. And clearly the sustainability is a huge problem. Yes, I will be at conference. I will be at conference. And I'll be saying more at conference as well.
So that's not the last you've heard of Liz Truss. Not only a book coming out in April, but Rishi Sunak will look forward to hearing. I don't know, actually. That is worth checking. But Rishi Sunak will also no doubt get the benefit of her views at conference next month.
I appreciate your question was brilliant and probably had her reeling for an answer. But did it sound to you, as it did to me, as if she was waiting for someone in her ear to stop speaking before she started actually articulating her answer?
Yeah, it was quite peculiar, because she sort of doesn't really look at you when she's answering the question, and it did certainly take a while for me to ascertain what her view was on the triple lock. I think all in all it could be summarised that she doesn't feel it's sustainable in the long term.
And that's probably Mark Carney's fault, or the BBC's.
Yes, there were a number of different groups, as I referenced.
I'm trying to remember the story. Henry, great work, mate, as always. And you sound to the manner born, actually, there in the press conference with the former Prime Minister. And I mean that, genuinely, I know I tease you a lot, but I mean that as a compliment. It sounded really, really good. It was a really good question.
Thank you.
No, thank you.
Thank you.
12:40 is the time. We are contemplating the relevance of religious education. I'm trying to remember the time that Liz Truss turned down an opportunity to criticise a journalist. I'm going to get you to do it. Can you find it for me? No, not you. It's all right. You can carry on producing the show. You listening, can you find it for me? There was a time when, because she criticised journalists all the time. She blamed the media for everything. She singles out the BBC for particular abuse. But I'm sure there was a time when someone in the media did something really bad, and she said, I don't like to criticise the media. If you can find that, I'll give you the money myself. 12:41 is the time. Mona is in Brixton to steer us back to RE. Mona, what would you like to say?
First of all, I'd like to say how happy I am to be talking to you.
Well, clap your hands. If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands.
I am.
We did that in religious education.
Well, no, especially as I'm a many-time caller and a first-time get-througher. So today is a momentous moment.
Thank you.
Anyway, I just wanted to say that I'm not a religious person, but I used to love our RE lessons at school. I mean, this is my personal experience. I mean, the first caller, Lisa, spoke from education, which was really, really good.
Yes.
But for me, I loved the lessons because the teacher would set us questions that really made me think. I remember at that time it was the Hillsborough disaster. Shows how old I am.
Yes.
And the question was, if there is a God, how does he allow such things to happen?
Gosh, yes.
And, and I went home and I spoke to my dad and I spoke to there was an essay, for homework, and I spoke to my mum and I spoke to some neighbours and my brothers. I really thought about it, and in their answers, it gave me such a broad perspective of different opinions.
Yes.
And it made me realise, and it kind of really shaped who I am and how I went on to study and work and so on, is that when you are faced with something, there are so many different versions and different perspectives.
Well, do you know what I wonder, actually, whether... Because I think we might be of a similar age, and given your reference to Hillsborough...
66.
How
I'm
old?
older than you.
66.
56. I'm older
56.
than you.
5, 6.
No, 66.
Okay, you are a bit older than me. But... And it may have changed now for subsequent generations, but do you think there was any subject in which we did thinking as deeply as we did in religious education? Like, just think, because that question there about a benign God allowing terrible things to happen is an absolute humdinger. You know, it's a classic of the genre. But you don't do that in here. You don't do, why did Henry VIII kill his wives? Because you know the answer.
Yeah.
So that the actual thinking, the whirring of the little grey cells, as Hercule Poirot would say, that was confined to religious education.
It was, and such kind of moral and basic questions. Like, there was another question to this day is in my head, and I still don't kind of know an answer to, but is it best to do the right thing for the wrong reason or the wrong thing for the right reason?
Yeah.
And again, it stopped me in my tracks, and I don't think I ever felt more infused about homework than the RE.
No, I can completely see why. I mean, it's the way your intellect is primed, and as you say, you talk about it. I mean, you could have called it, on the second question, it could have just been filed under ethics, couldn't it, or under moral education. It doesn't have to have a religious element to it. But given that so much of our morality, socially speaking, is built upon religious backgrounds, is built upon the Judeo-Christian tradition in this country at the moment, then you ask a question like that, and it's almost inevitably going to be knocking on the door of religious education. Thank you, Mona. Did that live up to your expectations, that debut?
Fascinating. And also, sorry, to mention this idea of the ethical thing.
Yes.
It isn't ethical, but where else in the program, in our schooling, do ethics come into play? You know,
possibly in geography if you've got a speech impediment.
Oh,
you've got to think about it. You've got to think about it. That, Mona, thank you. You've taken me right up to the junction. 12:48 is the time. I can't remember the precise. Yes, I can. It's in Spare in his memoir, and I think it's shortly after his mum died, and his dad tried to comfort him in the palace, and he wrote. I'm going to get you the clip actually because it's important. He wrote. He talks about how his dad struggles to show emotion at the best of times, and then writes and then says very loyally, how could he be expected to show them in such a crisis? But his hand did fall once more on my knee, and he said, "It's going to be okay." That was quite a lot for him. Fatherly, hopeful, kind, and so very untrue. Because this, of course, is when Harry was 12 and things were, for his mental health at least, going to get a hell of a lot worse. He stood and left. I don't recall how I knew that he'd already been in the other room, that he'd already told Willie, but I knew. So this is after he's broken the news of Diana's death to Prince Harry. And Harry writes, "I lay there, or sat there. I didn't get up. I didn't bathe, didn't pee, didn't get dressed, didn't call out to Willie or Mabel. After decades of working to reconstruct that morning, I've come to one inescapable conclusion. I must have remained in that room, saying nothing, seeing no one, until 9 a.m. sharp, when the piper began to play outside. I wish I could remember what he played, but maybe it doesn't matter. With bagpipes, it's not the tune, it's the tone. Thousands of years..." So it wasn't me getting emotional, that was a genuine frog in my throat, but you could be forgiven for getting emotional in the next couple of minutes. "Thousands of years old, bagpipes are built to amplify what's already in the heart. If you're feeling silly, bagpipes make you sillier. If you're angry, bagpipes bring your blood to a higher boil. And if you're in grief, even if you're 12 years old and don't know you're in grief, maybe especially if you don't know, bagpipes can drive you mad." Two things. Number one, the reason why he talks about decades of working to reconstruct that morning is because that's how therapy works. You work out where your mental blockages come from, where your emotional blockages and problems come from. You trace them back to sources, and that obviously is going to be the source of a lot of the stuff that would have held Harry back from being his best self, his authentic self over the years. But I'm reading you that because it was the closing ceremony of the Invictus Games this weekend, something that he has worked very hard, of course, to both promote and ensure the survival of. And he gave a speech at the closing ceremony, which, had it been any other member of the British royal family, would have received widespread coverage in this country. But given that it's Harry and so much of the media, I think, sadly, in collaboration with vested interests in the royal family, have sort of rendered him persona non grata. And his wife, of course, also persona non grata. I saw a television station this morning once again wheeling out her father to share his sob stories live on national television, and then wonder why his daughter feels horribly alienated from him. If you want a rapprochement with your daughter, my advice would be to contact her privately and stay away from television cameras. But hey-ho, what do I know? This is a lovely moment during the closing ceremony, during his closing speech, which will help you understand why I've just read you the bit from his memoir about bagpipes.
I met with Master Corporal James Gendron from the Canadian team in the Invictus 2025 tent. While we were chatting, I noticed bagpipes lying on the floor in the far corner. Some of you may know what bagpipes mean to me, so I couldn't help but hope that they'd be played. Little did I know that 30 minutes later, it would be James picking them up and offering to play. Yet I had no idea what they meant to him. Nor did I know what memories they triggered for him. In Afghanistan, he played 63 ramp ceremonies for 63 caskets, for 63 souls, for 63 families. After that last ceremony, he couldn't touch them. This week, he wasn't even sure whether he could bring himself to play them. But he did. What had once haunted him, dare I say it, may now be what helps heal him. Thank you, James, for your service, for your courage, and for sharing your gift.
It's pretty lovely, right? Unless you really have had your brains boiled by some of the coverage of that man and his work, the Invictus Games closing ceremony there. It'd be nice to see a little bit more reporting of this astonishing international success story. It is 12:53 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I think he might have played, because I followed the story quite closely, I think he might even have played Happy Birthday to Prince Harry on his bagpipes because because it was his birthday. I've lost the tweet. Someone replied, a lovely bloke who'd been at the Invictus Games replied to my tweet yesterday. It was at the top of my replies yesterday when I checked, so I didn't think I needed to make a note of it today, but my apologies for not being able to share that today either. It is 12:54, very nearly 12:55. Back to religious education. Mark's in Canterbury. Mark, what made you pick up the phone?
Hi. I trained as a teacher, and my primary training included a bit of teaching RE, and we had a 2-hour instructional session, so that was the only thing that we got to prepare us for teaching RE. And in that, we focused on the major world religion.
Yes.
Now, we had a big debate because one of the ones that we talked about was Sikhism. And of course, that's not really a major world religion. It's very big in the UK. But if you look across the whole world, there's not that many of them.
What, Sikhism?
Yeah.
I don't think it's just the UK where it's big, is it?
No. It is elsewhere. But if you compare it to like Taoism or,
something. Yes.
Yeah, it's not in the top 6, should we say. And Buddhism, which we talked about, is not even considered a religion by some people.
But I suppose these are the top 6 religions that somebody living in Britain is likely to encounter.
Exactly.
Yes.
And so my argument would be that what really benefited us was being able to talk about the cultures of the people in the school and understand each other better. So where I've taught RE, it's been a conversation and sharing a bit about yourself. We've had festivals, schools are quite big on doing Diwali and, we talk about Eid when people are on their kind of preparations for their ceremonies and things and having days off. And so that conversation starter and being able to communicate it about in the lesson is really good. So I love the philosophy idea.
If you were quite an authoritarian parent and you were raising your children in quite a a blinkered way, religious education would be your enemy, wouldn't it?
Definitely, and it's difficult to argue because you want your child to be educated in their religion.
Yes, of course.
But you don't want necessarily for them to know about every other religion's pros and cons. It does come up, but for the most part, parents accept that it's taught in this is not the truth, this is just an opinion way, which is, I suppose, the step away from religious instruction where people are told things very directly. In fact, a couple of my friends picked a primary school based on the non-religious nature of it.
Yeah, fair enough.
And then they were very unhappy because their child came home telling them all about how Jesus had done this, Jesus had done that. And they would say, well, we're at home and we're telling them something entirely different. And it was upsetting to be told that this was the truth.
Yes. I suppose you can teach the gospel, you can teach the act of of Jesus without necessarily teaching the creationist story and stuff like that. But it is, the more you teach, the more the stranglehold upon young minds is loosened, actually, I would have thought, by religious, what I'd loosely describe as religious bigotry or religious indoctrination.
I think you can say it in a constructive way. So I tend to approach, when I talk about God, and some people believing that the world was created 5,000 years ago, and I say, well, if God is all-powerful, that is possible, because he could have left dinosaur bones and historical stuff as a thing for us to investigate without it actually, it is possible. I'm not saying it's the truth, but,
I'm not even commenting on how likely it is, but it is technically possible. In the same way, I suppose, that it's technically possible that history will judge Liz Truss as having been a competent Prime Minister, just to knit together the topic with which we opened the programme this morning and the topic with which we conclude it this afternoon. It is coming up to 12:59. My apologies to Gordon and Craig and Chris and Tracy and Rena and Lauren and another Chris, two Chris's. We should return to this at some point, shouldn't we? But we can't now because we have run out of time. If you missed any of today's show, you can listen back on Catch Up on Global Player, where you can rewind live radio or enjoy the whole show podcast. You'll also find all of LBC's shows there to catch up on, as well as the world's biggest podcast. So do rewind live radio on Global Player. Download it for free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. Coming up at 4 on LBC, it's Tom Swarbrick, but now it's time for Sangeeta Maiska. 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 For Sangeeta Maiska.